good to be here with you all. Thank you for spending your Saturday evening as part of one of our lovely conversations. It is always fun to interact with all of you. Wow. So glad you're here. I'm going to hit so I get all of the chat messages, not just the ones that are considered top. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Be sure to post this on Reddit, on Twitter, on Facebook. Get the word around. The more people that are here, the more fun we have. Now, folks, I'm so glad to be able to engage with all of you tonight. The way we do things is I give my opening remarks. I write down your super chats as they come in. We do our roll call, and then I answer your super chats until they're done. The way it works is if you give me a super chat, I will give you an answer. Will not necessarily be the answer that you want. Sometimes I give very long answers. Sometimes I give very short answers, depending on what the question is. So there you go. Be sure to hit the like button. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. With no further ado, I think we're going to just jump right into it. Folks, communication. So much of what we do as socialists, and as those who more broadly, just people who are interested in politics, people who want to create political change, so much of what we do is about communication. And small business. So much of what we do is about communication. And communication has become easier because of technology, but it's become harder because of technology. It's become easier because of technology. Look, could you imagine how amazing it would have been if Eugene Debs and Gus Hall and William Z. Foster had access to, YouTube live stream? Can you imagine how amazing that would be if they'd been able to communicate with their followers? I have spent so much time scouring the internet, looking for old speeches by communist leaders from the United States and all that. Can you imagine if the communication technology that's available in our time had been available back then, how much, we would be able to learn from them. But it's easier in the sense that it's easier to spread messages. But yet at the same time, Marxist concept of love, the same time that it's easier to spread messages across the world, broadcast them, it's gotten harder. It's gotten harder because we don't all share the same point of reference. Look, if I were to say to you, tree, an image would immediately pop into your mind. Now, that image is going to be different for every person. Some of you might think of a pine tree. Some of you might think of a palm tree. Some of you might think of an apple tree. And the feelings that you have in association with the tree that comes into your mind are going to be very different. Some people are going to have memories of climbing trees as children. Some people might have a memory of a car accident in which their car crashed into a tree. But yet, when I say tree, an image pops into your mind immediately, and you then have feelings, whether you're conscious of them or not, feelings associated with that tree, with that image. And for every person, that is different. There are many different kinds of trees, and furthermore, there are many, many different associations and emotions and memories that we all have in association with those different kinds of trees. And this kind of thing is what makes it difficult to be an effective speaker or orator or writer. Because what you're trying to do as a speaker or an orator or a writer, and when you communicate with people, is you're trying to get them to feel a way that you would like them to feel. You're trying to get them to understand a concept that you were trying to get them to understand. And when everyone has their own life experience, everyone has their own thoughts, everyone has their own images that pop into their head, it can become very, very difficult. If you look at what politicians do, politicians are very, very good at pushing buttons for people, saying the words that draw up the right images in people's minds, the right feelings in people's minds, pushing people a certain way. And that becomes increasingly harder and harder to do because nowadays there is less and less and less shared experience and shared points of reference. You know, it used to be that everyone watched the same thing on television. Back in the 1950s and 60s, people would have 3 TV stations. They would have 3 channels on their television. Now we have hundreds of channels. We have Netflix. We have YouTube. So if you make a joke about a popular television program, it's a little bit risky because there's a very good chance a lot of the people in your audience are not going to get it. You know, in the 1950s, no matter where you were in the United States, you could make jokes about Ed Sullivan because everyone who had a television knew who Ed Sullivan was. Nowadays, you cannot do things like that. We increasingly don't have shared experiences, shared points of reference. And so it's very hard to communicate. And especially social media gives us all our own little universe. The topics that we are interested in, the circles of people we associate with, and increasingly cuts us off from each other. The shared narrative, the shared point of reference, the shared associations, the shared feelings you can draw from people. It's no longer uniform. It's very, very difficult. And part of the reason that we're seeing an increasing polarization in politics, and part of the reason we're increasingly seeing difficulty in just forming groups and getting people to maintain friendships and get along with each other, pandemics aside, part of the reason that it's very difficult to do that is because of the fact that we are increasingly living in our own little bubbles. But the thing is, and let me add that it seems like so much of what I hear on the internet from all sides of politics, left, right, synthetic left, mainstream hardline left, social democrats, anarchists, tankies, right-wing, left-wing, liberals, conservatives, Trumpers, fascists, so much of what we hear is people saying, I want you to understand my pain. That seems to be so much of what I see on the internet these days, from all political perspectives. People are saying, I want you to understand my pain, and your pain doesn't count because you don't understand my pain. And it seems to be a lot of what's going on. It's like people are saying, I'm suffering, I feel threatened, I have been through this hardship in my life, and I am going to shout that I have this perception, I have this fear, I have this anxiety, I have this anger, and in my little universe, I want validation for my anger, my fear, my insecurity, my perception, and I want to shout at you until you understand it. Meanwhile, other people who don't agree with you are saying, no, your fear, your anxiety, your perception is not important because you don't understand my fear and my anxiety and my perception. And we live in this universe where if somebody doesn't validate our fear, our perception, our anger, we cut them off. And we surround ourselves with people who validate our fear, our conception, our anger. And that's all well and good, because then we get to play off each other's fear and play off each other's anger, play off each other's insecurities, and our anger can get bigger, and our fears can get bigger, and our perceptions can get bigger. And the fears and perceptions and angers of other people are nowhere to be found. We can cut them off. And this is the reality of our time. It's how communication has really changed because of technology. And this is all well and good if you just want to live in your little world and live your little life. It's all well and good to live that way. But if your job is to change society, if you're trying actively to find people who do not agree with you and win them over to your point of view, that's increasingly harder in our time. Increasingly, it is much, much harder in our time to do that because we don't share the same points of reference. And I had a little bit of an exchange on Twitter with a social democrat, well, the Jacobin guy. I look back on that exchange, and it's interesting. It made me think. Because, we have talked on these lives endlessly about getting into the minds of Trump supporters, getting into the minds of conservatives, and we've scolded and castigated liberals and social democrats for not wanting to do that. How dare they not want to get into the minds of Trump supporters? How dare they, out of the movement to the masses, the left is cutting itself off, the synthetic, right? And we'll keep doing that. That's going to be a recurring theme on here. Don't worry. I'm excited because a friend of mine is actually going to be giving a presentation at the next conference of the Center for Political Innovation, our next web conference, about the different types of Trump supporters and how to talk to them. He's preparing a PowerPoint presentation. I'm very excited to see it. So we'll keep talking about that. And that is a valid criticism of the mainstream of the left, the synthetic left, their inability to talk to ordinary people, their making of leftism kind of an exclusive, isolated, the shrill tone, etc. That's a valid criticism. But for tonight, because I'm interested in constantly trying to enhance my ability to communicate with all kinds of people, and because I think that as a socialist, one should be constantly trying to enhance their ability to communicate with all kinds of different people, the role of prison reform advocates. Okay. Because of that, I want to kind of reflect on the question, why do some people become social democrats? And why do some people become tankies? And that's a fair question. What is the difference in motivation? Not the difference in ideology, right? We all know the difference in ideology. There are a huge amount of people now that are interested in socialism, but to them, socialism means no state involvement. Socialism means worker cooperative businesses. Socialism is not illiberal, and it means they have nothing but hostility to the countries like China and Russia and the Soviet Union and Cuba and Venezuela who've tried to build socialism, right? For them, this is a cultural movement, largely. This is a rejection of middle America. This is a rejection of average American Trump supporters. It's a cultural statement. The folks with, piercings and pink and purple hair and a lot of interesting emojis on Twitter and why are they the way they are? Number one. And what are the different ways of understanding the way they are? And why am I and we the way we are? And what can we learn from this? What can we learn from them? And what can they learn from us, right? We need to think beyond ourselves, right? If we are going to be able to communicate with people of different persuasions and different perceptions, we need to understand how they see things. And based on that, we have to figure out how to communicate with them. Now, obviously, I argue that it is easier to recruit average Americans to real socialism than it is to recruit a social democrat or a liberal to real socialism. I'll be honest. But at the same time, why is that? And what is the real difference? What is the motivation for someone to become a social democrat? And why? Why do people do that? And why do we do what we do? It's important to know all these things. What is the motivation for you in going down the political road you went on? And what's the motivation for other people for going down the political road that they've gone on? What is the reason? Why does this happen? Right? So obviously, for all of us, our first point of reference is going to be ourselves. The first point of reference is going to be ourselves. We know our own lives better than we know anyone else's. So why did I become and why do I remain a tankie? First of all, what is a tankie, right? Let's be clear on this, right? There's so much confusion about this. Remember, I debated Jabba the Vosh, and he couldn't he couldn't be clear about whether I was or was not a tankie. He couldn't make up his mind. Well, as far as I'm concerned, right? Well, let's just back up. The term tankie, we know where it came from. It was in the British Communist Party during the 1970s, when the rise of Euro-communism took place, when the 1978, you had the Italian Communist Party, the French Communist Party, and the Spanish Communist Party cut their ties with the Soviet Union and denounced the Soviet Union. And they became known as the Euro-communists. And Zbigniew Brzezinski actually named them Euro-communists. They denounced the Soviet Union and its military interventions. Big moment to have these huge communist parties. The French Communist Party had huge neighborhoods, and still to this day it has millions of members. It's a huge organization. The Italian Communist Party, again, huge territories and provinces. The Spanish Communist Party had just brought down Franco and was finally legal and had millions of people who admired it for its role in the overthrow of the fascist regime of Franco. So, when they cut their ties with the Soviet Union, that was big. I mean, these were not small organizations. So in the British Communist Party, there were some people in the British Communist Party who supported this decision by the French and the Italian and the Spanish Communist Party cutting their ties with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. But those who did not, and those who supported the Soviet Union and maintained a friendly attitude towards the Soviet Union were called tankies. And why were they labeled tankies? It was not a friendly term. It was a derogatory term. Now, some of us use it with pride, but it's a derogatory term. I mean, and why was it a derogatory term? Well, it's a derogatory term because at the time, the way Soviet military interventions were being portrayed on global television was with tanks. Right? And they talked about it was an amazing propaganda tactic on the part of American media. Whenever the Soviet Union sent its military to any country, they would show these big, scary-looking, mean-looking tanks, these mechanical, cold pieces of machinery rolling in. It was like Darth Vader or something, bomb, 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 ba bomb, bomb, ba bomb. The Soviet Union has sent its forces in. It was like this scary, evil military, and they didn't show faces of soldiers. They didn't say what the arguments were about the Soviet Union and why it had sent its troops in. It simply said, it showed this mean, evil tank rolling in. And it started with the Prague Spring, 1968, in Czechoslovakia. You had Dubček, who was a leader of Czechoslovakia and was anti-Soviet. He took power and immediately cut off support to the people of Vietnam in their fight against for national liberation, cut off support to the Vietnamese people, and was starting to be friendly with some of the fascist groups that had collaborated with the Nazis and all of that. But he was talking like he was a democratic socialist as opposed to an evil Stalinist or whatever. And the instability and so. The Soviet Union sent its military to put down this revolt by Dubček, right? And of course, American media showed the youthful protesters who were supporters of Dubček, the children of the party elite, the most privileged people in Soviet society. It's so funny because the American media loves to, complain about Soviet bureaucracy. The people that were protesting in the streets in support of Dubček were all like party bureaucrats. They showed them as peace-loving hippies with flowers. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, in its intervention in Czechoslovakia, was portrayed as, these cold, evil tanks rolling in. It was brilliant. Brilliant propaganda on America's part. And the same, there's a very good book called Washington's Secret War in Afghanistan by Philip Banaski. And he was a reporter for the People's World, the Communist Party newspaper, and he was living in Afghanistan, and he reported. And when the first Soviet troops entered Afghanistan, the Soviet Union sent troops to Afghanistan. That was at the time when, there was a socialist government. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan had taken office. And in response to that, you had Osama bin Laden and al-Zarqawi and all kinds of mujahideen and, extremists from around the Muslim world being shipped into Saudi Arabia. And at the time, right, the Soviet Union, at the request of the government of Afghanistan, sent its military to support the Afghan government. And when that happened, of course, the U.S. media portrayed it as Soviet imperialism, Soviet interventionism, and Philip Banaski, in his book, he describes how there was one single tank in a park in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan. But all the news media from Western countries surrounded that tank, right? All the news media, all the cameras, NBC, ABC, BBC, they all surrounded this tank in the park in Afghanistan. Why? Because that tank, that was how Soviet interventions were portrayed on television. The Soviet Union is not a country with people in it. It's just a cold mechanical tank. It's an evil empire, as Ronald Reagan called it. And interestingly, this idea that the Soviet Union are all, what they were doing is they were essentially erasing the experience of all the people in Czechoslovakia who didn't want the overthrow of socialism. Right? There were a lot of people in Czechoslovakia who didn't support the Prague Spring, who were happy that the Soviet Union had aligned with Czechoslovakia and built hospitals and wiped out illiteracy and raised people from poverty. Well, didn't portray those people in their opinions, portrayed a bunch of tanks. In Afghanistan, there were a lot of women who didn't want to get acid poured on their faces by crazy Wahhabi Osama bin Laden Mujahideen fighters. And they wanted literacy campaigns, and they liked the fact the Soviet Union was reforesting the country and was trying to build infrastructure. And they liked the fact that the Democratic Youth Brigades, organized by the People's Democratic Party, were trying to get a situation where maybe railroads and industry could come into Afghanistan. There were many, many Afghans who supported the People's Democratic Party and supported the Soviet Union sending its military to support the People's Democratic Party. However, you didn't see those, right? As Philip Banaski says in his book, all you saw was this tank, right? And that this image of the tank was a way to dehumanize one side of the argument. The people that were against the Soviet Union were young, idealistic, democratic socialists, people who love democracy, people who just want freedom and human rights. They're not pro-communist or anti-communist. They just want love and freedom and kumbaya, and they sing John Lennon songs, and they want to wear blue jeans, and it was like, that was the one side of it. Meanwhile, the only argument in response is cold mechanical tank. So of course, if one side is not represented by arguments or people with a story or people with an opinion, and the other side is going to win. And so this is how American propaganda was very effective during the Cold War. And the tank was a very effective part of that. So the name tanky, the label of tanky that was given to supporters of the Soviet Union was to say, basically, you're such a demented authoritarian. You have such a military fetish. You are such an authoritarian, personality. You are such a stiff, firm, I don't know what. You're so brainwashed that you like when those evil tanks roll in and crush the beautiful hippies who just want freedom and democracy across Eastern Europe and in Afghanistan and elsewhere. That's where the narrative, that's the term. And so it's a derogatory term. The term tanky is a very, very derogatory term, but it's stuck. And now it's all over the internet. They're talking about tankies. And there's a lot of people like myself who say, you know what? I'm a tanky. I'm a tanky not because I like, the suppression of civil liberties, not because I want peaceful protesters to be massacred or anything like that. I'm not a supporter of tanks. But I do think the Soviet Union played a very good role in the history of the world. The Soviet Union, raised millions out of poverty, defeated the Nazis in World War II, and launched satellites into orbit and invented space travel. It built the Aswan Dam and brought electricity to Egypt. It gave aid to people like Nelson Mandela and the people of so many countries in the world that were fighting for their national liberation. It made the issue of the black struggle in the United States and African Americans a worldwide conversation by highlighting the oppression of African Americans. The Soviet Union, it did a lot to improve the conditions of women. It made some amazing films. The father of the montage, Sergei Eisenstein. The music of Shostakovich. It wiped out illiteracy. It industrialized a whole country. It created a situation where millions of people from around the world went to the Soviet Union to get education. Sure, I know Richard Benhurst, yeah. Writing it down. The Soviet Union, it did some pretty good things. And so if saying that the Soviet Union was a socialist society, which it was, and saying that it, despite its flaws, which I will happily admit, that it played a good role, if that makes me a tanky, I guess I'm a tanky. So I wear that term tanky with pride. I absolutely do. But why did I become a tanky? And why are these people, like the Jacobinites or the various people that are now speaking in the name of socialism, why do they not become tankies? What is going on here? Well, honestly, and I try to raise this in a non-derogatory way. Okay, I am not, I'm going to say the issue. There is a class issue here. Okay, but that sounds like an attack. That sounds like me saying, well, I'm more working class than you. That's not what I'm saying here at all. That's not what I'm saying here at all. There is a class dynamic, and it's not about how much money you have. It's not really about how much money you have. It's not about, your particular class background. It's rather the kinds of arguments you're familiar having and the tone of argument that you're familiar having, and what it is that you aspire to create. Right? Because, look, I'm from a very small town in Ohio. Very small town in Ohio where I grew up. But it was a working class town. I think still to this day, the town of Orrville, Ohio is called a city of diversified industry. It's where Smucker's Jelly, where they made Smucker's, they made jelly. It's where their factory was. There was the Smith Dairy Plant, a dairy processing facility. There were a couple other factories in town. There was a place, I think it was called Flow Torque. It made like car parts or something, and I don't even remember what they... And there was another place that made air conditioning parts, and a lot of those plants and factories are closed down. But, it's surrounded by... It's a rural town. But that's the town I grew up in. And what I remember is that in my town in particular, these class differences, if you want to call them that, played themselves out. Right? These differences, in a tiny town of 4,000 or 5,000 people, this difference in approaches in itself, I could see. For example, one thing I remember, I brought a good friend of mine, to church with me one Sunday. I attended the United Church of Christ, which was, formerly the Congregational Church. It's a more mainline Protestant church. And, I attended the United Church of Christ. The United Church of Christ was the church that a lot of doctors and lawyers went to. And this friend of mine who attended church with me, his family attended the Baptist church, the, fundamental Baptist church, where a lot of factory workers and working class people went. I remember one thing that my friend told me about the differences between our two churches. He said, "Your church is really calm, Caleb. Your church is really calm." And I said, "What do you mean?" Well, another Sunday I went with him to his church. His church was not very calm. Lots of yelling, lots of waving the Bible around, lots of screaming, lots of, very emotional, powerful stuff. Well, it's not simply a theological difference, right? The congregation of Baptist churches and evangelical churches and mega churches and the congregation of mainline Protestant denominations are very different. One is middle class. The other is more working class. Now, obviously, there were plenty of working class people who went to my church, and there were probably a few middle class people who went to his. But the tone of the two church services was very, very different. And the message is a little bit different, At the church that I grew up in, they were always emphasizing, moral reasoning and discernment. This idea that you should be wrangling with yourself. Am I doing the right thing? Am I not doing the right thing? And there was this kind of you should be constantly having a moral dialogue in your head about, are you doing the right thing? But if one attends an evangelical church, it's much more about how there are clear rules and you must follow them. And if you don't follow them, you go to hell. But if you do follow them, you can be saved. It's much more, it's a very different message. They're not calling on you to constantly be wrangling with yourself and battling over what is right and wrong. They're calling on you to live by strict principles and adhere to those principles and not change from those principles. And again, though, this is rooted in class. And this is just in my little town, right? This is just in a little town in Ohio. The class differences in the entire United States are far bigger than the class differences in my little tiny town. I'm just telling you, there are differences in approaches. And one thing I have noticed about social democrats is they don't seem to understand American anti-communism. Or at least, maybe that's not even fair. Maybe I should say, their experience with American anti-communism is very different from mine. The way I understood American anti-communism was, I was told communism has failed everywhere it has ever been tried. It has failed everywhere it's ever been tried. Communist governments murdered millions of people. They killed more than Hitler. And no one should ever be a communist because it's against America. And it's against America. And keep in mind, this wasn't said simply in response to Marxism-Leninism. This was said in response to socialism. You said that you're a supporter of socialism. They would say, socialism, that's what the Soviet Union had. And it's failed everywhere it's ever been tried, never had one single success. And it killed millions of people. That was the narrative I got. I've noticed that a lot of these social democrats don't seem familiar with that narrative. That's what most of America thinks about socialism and communism. They think socialism and communism have failed everywhere they've ever been tried. They've never had any success. They killed millions of people. Being a socialist is the same as being an admirer of Hitler. These are murderous regimes, and if you love America, if you're a patriotic American, you must never, ever even think of being a socialist. It's blasphemous against the American way of life. That's what most Americans think. But I've noticed social democrats, the kind of people that become democratic socialists, the kind of people that become Jacobin crowd, they don't seem to have experienced that. Fall of the Soviet Union because of the role in 1959. Okay. Fall of USSR. Coup. Iran. War. They don't seem to. They really don't seem to understand that. Right? And I remember when I was first getting into Marxism and socialism as a young man, I remember you should advocate 21st century socialism, view internationalism, healthy trading. Should an American advocate? Okay. Spreading worldwide proletariat, building a healthy. Okay. All right. 21st century. Socialism. Multi-trade. Worldwide revolution. All right, very good question. And what I noticed was that a lot of those folks are not familiar with that. I tried to be a social democrat. I actually remember in my little town, around the time the Iraq War was starting, I tried to be a democratic socialist or a social democrat. And the response that I got to saying I was an advocate of socialism, saying I was an advocate of social democracy, was communism killed millions of people. Everyone knows that socialism's failed. Socialism's never worked anywhere. That was the response I got. And that forced me to do some investigation. And I've told this story many times, but I went to the library, the public library, because I was arguing with people about socialism. People were constantly telling me socialism everywhere has been a failure. It's never accomplished anything. I went to the public library, and I got my hands on a book by Leon Trotsky called Revolution Betrayed. And I opened it, hoping that Trotsky would explain to me how the Soviet Union was not really socialist, but how there could be a good kind of socialism. That's what I thought. That's the title of the book, Revolution Betrayed. And I opened, and as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, probably 12 or 13, I opened The Revolution Betrayed. And the first chapter of The Revolution Betrayed by Leon Trotsky was called What Has Been Achieved. And that's for the first chapter of Leon Trotsky's big manifesto against the Soviet Union. The first chapter is called What Has Been Achieved. And it is him going over the economic successes of the Soviet Union. And I read this and my jaw hung open. I thought, this can't be true. Everybody knows that socialism everywhere has just led to starvation and death and has never accomplished anything. And I read he's going over about all the wheat that they're producing, all the tractors they're producing. And I thought, this can't be true. This can't be true. Right? Everybody knows the Soviet Union has never accomplished anything. It was failed everywhere it's ever been tried. Communism doesn't work. It leads to mass starvation and death. And I'm reading just page after page. Trotsky goes on and on and on about the Soviet Union is producing commodities and they're electrifying the country. And this Trotsky was an enemy of the Soviet Union. He was eventually killed, as an enemy of the Soviet Union. But I'm reading this in Trotsky's writing, and I thought, this can't be true. So then I went to the encyclopedia. Do you remember encyclopedias before they had the internet, or when the internet was just getting started? There was this thing called the encyclopedia. So I went to the encyclopedia. I think it was the World Book, it was called, the World Book Encyclopedia. And I pulled out the volume, the S volume for Soviet Union. And there was a section in the encyclopedia article about the Soviet Union. There was a section on economy. And even though it was not really emphasized, even though they did emphasize things like the, Holodomor and such, they did say, there was a couple paragraphs, the Soviet Union has vastly expanded the life expectancy of the Soviet people. My jaw dropped. The Soviet Union has industrialized. Massacre in Taiwan. The Soviet Union has industrialized, it has built huge power, and I thought, this can't be true. Everyone's told me that never has communism or socialism ever had any achievements. And I'm reading there about all these amazing things the Soviet Union had done, and and of course the World Book Encyclopedia was not emphasizing them. It only gave them a few paragraphs, but the facts were there. What Trotsky had said in The Revolution Betrayed was confirmed by what the World Book Encyclopedia said. The Soviet Union had actually had big economic achievements. So what everyone was telling me was a crock of lies. The premise of the American narrative about communism was a crock of utter lies. What everybody knows in the United States, that socialism never worked anywhere, it's failed everywhere it's ever been tried, was not true. And there is no way it could ever be possibly true. The economic data is there. The Soviet Union built the world's largest power plant, the Dnieper Dam, the hydroelectrical power plant in Ukraine. The Soviet Union had full employment. The Soviet Union had more hospital beds per capita than any other country in the world. I mean, and I'm reading this, and I was just in utter shock. And that is when I immediately became a tankie. And the reason I became a tankie, it's funny, I became a tankie through Trotsky. It's kind of hilarious. I went from trot to tankie. And the reason for that was because at that point, what everyone was telling me, the argument against socialism, it's never worked anywhere, it's failed everywhere it's ever been tried, that argument, I learned, was a lie. And for me, at that point, I had to be a tankie. And on top of that, the Iraq War was happening. The USA was invading Iraq. And the justification for invading Iraq was that Saddam Hussein was just like Stalin. Saddam Hussein was just like Fidel Castro. He's just like Mao. Saddam Hussein is one of these regimes, these third world regimes. And I discovered that the United States was supporting governments like Saudi Arabia, and so I immediately became suspicious. Immediately I became suspicious of any demonization. Whenever the government is telling us that, some leader around the world is an evil dictator, I immediately became suspicious of that. So if you add the Iraq War and the weapons of mass destruction that never happened, that never appeared, that were lied about, were falsified, and if you add to that the downright lie that everybody knew about the Soviet Union that was very, very easy to debunk, at that point, I wasn't interested in being a democratic socialist. I wasn't. I wasn't interested in being a sock dam. And in fact, when people did that, I got angry with them because they were feeding into the big lie. And I noticed that it seemed, in my experience, whenever, whenever there was any conversation about progressive economic reforms, Stalin and the Soviet Union came up. I noticed that. In my little town, on American television, on the radio, on TV, every time anyone proposed raising the minimum wage, they'd say, oh, yeah, well, where's that ever worked? Look at the Soviet Union. They tried to give everyone a decent wage. That failed, right? Healthcare, why don't we have national healthcare? That's never worked anywhere in the world. Never worked. Look at the Soviet Union. The government ran the healthcare and everyone starved and died and they were miserable. And the big lie that socialism and communism has never accomplished anything, never achieved anything, that big lie underlies all economic discourse in the United States. All of economic discourse in the United States centers around that big, fat lie. And so, being a socialist for me has always been tied up in refuting that big lie. But I think that for a lot of these social democrats, they seem to live in an atmosphere where that big lie is not as pervasive. See, for them, the criticism of the Soviet Union isn't that it never had any economic successes. I've noticed that in some of the attacks on me. There'll be certain individuals that'll criticize me, and they'll see me refuting the big lie that socialism has never worked ever. And they'll say, nobody ever says that. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. In the real world, they say that. But in the world that a lot of these liberals inhabit, they don't. You listen to NPR, right? Compare NPR to Rush Limbaugh, right? You got Rush Limbaugh. And Rush Limbaugh has a much more working class audience than NPR does. Now, you listen to Rush Limbaugh, he's like, the Democrats are a bunch of communists. They're traitors to America. They're liberals. And America's the greatest country in the world. America is right and the liberals are wrong. That's Rush Limbaugh. You listen to NPR. Oh, they got the little microphone. So today on NPR, we're going to be talking about whether Barack Obama's tax policies increased or decreased unemployment. And we have several university professors of economics who are going to discuss this. It's a very different tone. It's a very, very different tone. And just like the Baptist church in my town was much more fiery and loud and to the point, and much more black and white in their thinking than my mainstream Protestant church, NPR is much more bland and liberal, and everything's a matter of opinion, and is there truth on either side, than Rush Limbaugh is. Rush Limbaugh has a much more working class audience than NPR does. And then, let me add that there's another factor here. And this is an interesting factor because in this way I can almost relate a little bit to the more shrill folks in the Radlib camp. Because I also remember that in my little town, I lived in Ohio, and in 2004, in Ohio, there was a referendum on the ballot to ban gay marriage. To ban gay marriage. It was on the ballot. Could rebuild the labor aristocracy, potentially reignite class struggle. H.R. 24. Pro Act. All right. There was a constitutional amendment to the Ohio State Constitution to ban gay marriage that was on the ballot. I was opposed to it, as was my family, as were, a lot of the liberals that I knew. But the overwhelming majority of my town were for it. And I do remember that, one Sunday at my church, a woman came with the petition to ban gay marriage. And got up and said, if anyone wants to sign the petition to ban gay marriage, please, I'm here and you can sign the petition. Sports. And, of course, some of the liberals in the church, it was a more mainline Protestant church. Some of the liberals in the church weren't too happy with that. But I remember when the liberals in my little church got up, they didn't get up with a petition to legalize gay marriage. They got up and gave this very, very, very lame, like, you should really study this amendment, and we should discern as a group. And everything that the liberals did, the right wing, were so full of passion and so full of belief that right was on their side, so full of belief that their opponents were wrong, so full of principles. And the liberals were so full of, well, everything's kind of a matter of opinion, and, you know, and it bothered me because I felt very strongly like gay marriage should be legal. And I felt that my emotions were not being heard. I felt like the right wing, they could be very fiery against gay marriage. And I felt like the liberals were always, you know, everything's a matter of opinion. And I was like, where's the oomph? Where's the rage on my side? You know, and I felt very erased. And I almost felt angry at the liberals. And it seemed like that. A lot of things that liberals do are all very, very, you know, very, very, you know, there is no real truth. The truth is all somewhere in the middle. And so that was part of my development as well. And so all of this, if you know, we put the atmosphere of the Iraq War happening and being a big issue, if you put the atmosphere of everyone saying communism has never succeeded anywhere ever, and, you know, I'm learning that that's simply factually inaccurate. And if you look at my frustration with the liberals, who seemed that their response to the right wing being so full of passion and their response to it being, you're both right, all of that culminated in me becoming Mr. Caleb Maupin the tanky. And I've been a tanky ever since. And I'm going to be a tanky as long as I live. I mean, I don't ever imagine I'm going to, you know, would never join an imperialist crusade against a socialist or an anti-imperialist state. I would never, you know, do that. I'm going to be a tanky for the rest of my life. But it makes me wonder, right? These people that are social democrats, what would we have to say to them to get them to be tankies? Right? What kind of logical reasoning could we make to them? There is a class issue here. And at the end of the day, trying to recruit social democrats may be completely pointless, because at the end of the day, the working class is much bigger than the middle class. And the middle class is dying across the United States. The middle class is completely dying. It's falling apart. A lot of people whose parents were middle class are now working class. The American middle class is decaying. You know, there's a lot of, I mean, it's not happening like it once did. So that raises a question. But at the same time, you know, what do we do about this? Trot to neocon pipeline. So what do we do about this? I mean, what do we do? I mean, at the end of the day, socialism is only going to come through the working class. The middle class will not create socialism. And it seems to me like a lot of the base of social democracy is middle class thinking. It's NPR. And a lot of their arguments against Trump really reflect that. You know, obviously arguing that Trump is you know, bad for America's working families doesn't reflect that. His policies have hurt the American working class. That doesn't reflect that. Arguing that Donald Trump's, you know, anti-immigrant bigotry is awful. That doesn't reflect that. But why don't you answer questions from the regular chat? Okay. But the argument that, you know, Donald Trump is illiberal, right? That Donald Trump is riling up the vulgar workers, right? That Donald Trump is too anti-war, that Donald Trump is too friendly to anti-imperialist states around the world. You know, that Donald Trump is too negative on the country. He's saying that the country is falling apart, and that's just not true. That was an argument the New York Times made in response to Donald Trump's inauguration. There are some attacks on Donald Trump that show they're coming from a bad place. And the contempt for Donald Trump, in a lot of cases, it's mixed. There are genuine progressive critiques of Trump, like his policies, you know, that his tax cuts for the rich, his deregulation, etc. But there are also a lot of attacks that are coming from this very, very rad-lib place. And the fact that, that liberals, a lot of them can't tell the difference between progressives who support China, or progressives who support Cuba, or progressives who support Venezuela, and neo-Nazis. They genuinely can't tell the difference. And they immediately scream class reductionist and accuse anyone who talks about economics or class struggle of being a white supremacist. Shows that in a lot of ways, their anger at Trump, it's about maintaining their class position. It's based on this feeling that, okay, they want to stay in this middle class bubble. They want to stay in this liberal bubble where everything's a matter of opinion. And they are frightened of anybody talking like Rush Limbaugh, even from the left, right? They are frightened of any mass movement that says there is right and there is wrong in the world. They're frightened of it, right? Rush Limbaugh, he's on there saying, oh, America's the greatest, these liberals are all... They don't like that. But if someone was on there saying the truth, like capitalism is the problem and the workers need to rise up and fight for social, they're just as threatened by that. They live in this world where there is no clear truth, where everything's a matter of opinion. And they immediately consider anyone who does think that everything is not a matter of opinion, anyone who does think that there is right and wrong, anyone who does want to sacrifice, anyone who does want to stand for principles, they want to accuse that person. In their mind, that person is a vulgar worker, that person is ignorant, and that person is also, in their minds, that person is somehow dangerous and fascistic, right? This is how those folks think. So is it really worth it to try to appeal to social democrats or not? Is it really worth it? Is it really worth it? I mean, I stick with my original thesis, which is that we need to get out of the movement and get to the masses. Socialism is going to be created by the working class. The black working class, the white working class, the Chicano working class, the Asian working class. It's going to be working class people who want something to believe in, who want something to fight for, who want a better world, who do believe that right and wrong exists, who have clear principles and are ready to sacrifice. They are going to be the people who bring socialism to the United States. This middle class layer is not going to do it. So breaking socialism out of the middle class bubble, getting out of the movement and to the masses, is vitally, vitally important. But at the same time, if we want people to understand how we feel, we need to understand how they feel. If we want to understand how other people feel, we need to understand their motivations. We should constantly be trying to effectively develop our means of communication. We should constantly be trying to tear down the walls that divide us. We need to find out why people think what they think. Engage with them. What are people's feelings, right? We need to find this out. Intentional communities. Okay. All right. I mean, what do you think? Right? I mean, that's where I'm at. So I've just been thinking about that today, about the importance of communication, the difficulties of communication, social media, arguing with social democrats. And we emphasize a lot about how we're different, but, on some level, we're going to have to learn to approach these people, right? I mean, they're going to be around. They're not going to vanish. These social democrats are not going to go away. They're not going to go away. They're going to remain a factor. So we're going to have to learn how to communicate with them on some level. And there will probably be some good social democrats that we will be able to win over to real socialism. And there will be other social democrats that we may be able to form an alliance with, and build a bloc with strategically, on some issue or other. So we're going to have to figure out how it is that we can communicate with these people, right? These people would like to very much demonize us. They would like to tell everyone that we're all Nazis, that we're all white supremacists, even though we're the strongest anti-racists that ever were. And they're doing that because that's from a position of strength. The establishment favors them, obviously, over us, right? The establishment thinks that we're dangerous and that they're a tough pill to swallow, right? But ultimately we're the real danger. But at the same time, how is it that we can find the best and brightest elements among the social democratic camp and win them to be at least neutral or at least not completely hostile to us? How do we do that, right? How do we do that? All right. Good question. How do we do that? How do we go about doing that? Meanwhile, how do we stay true to our principles, but also, at the same time that we stay true to our principles, how do we compromise in a way that can build a broad, united front and a big coalition that could eventually bring socialism to the United States? There's a lot of contradictions, in being a socialist in our time. On the one hand, we're the most radical people around. On the other hand, we have to figure out how to build the broadest possible united front. Think about that, right? On the one hand, we're the most patriotic people that they are. We want the only thing that can really save this country from the horrors of capitalism. We love our country and our community so much that we want to get rid of capitalism. We are the most patriotic people that there are. On the other hand, we're the most internationalist people that there are. We're the ones that want the relationship between the United States and the rest of the world to get better. Will $15 minimum wage harm badly small businesses? All right. Okay. Think about it, right? We're the ones that want there to be friendship and peace with the rest of the world. We want to dismantle the economic system that is driving so much hostility to the United States around the world, that grinds countries around the world into poverty. We want to get rid of the global system of monopoly capitalism. So, in that sense, we're the most internationalist. There are many contradictory aspects of being a socialist in our time, and we are navigating all of this. We are in new territory. Anyone who thinks that we can apply Maduro suppressing. Anyone who thinks that we can simply apply formulas from the past, we can just open up what Lenin and Trotsky did and say, all right, on page 3 it says to do this, is wrong. Anyone who thinks that is absolutely wrong. We need to know what revolutions of the past have done. We need to study all of them, but we need to blindly follow none of them. We need to develop a formula that will work for our time. We need to develop a strategy for building class unity, a strategy for building a mass movement of people who say we need a government of action to fight for working families. We've got to figure out how it is that we can communicate a message to the broad masses of people that gets them to understand that capitalism is the enemy and gets them to become part of some kind of movement that can actually build it. But communication is really, really important. It's very funny. Years ago, I was in a group, and at one point I was arguing with somebody else in the group about tactics. They said to me, well, Caleb, all the other groups, they just talk about doing stuff. We're the group that actually does something. And it's funny because I remember saying to the person, I said, well, it's funny. So all these other groups, they talk about doing stuff. They have meetings where they talk. What we do is we go to the police station and get a protest permit. We then go to Times Square, and then the police set up a cage around us. Then we set up a sound system, and we hold signs and take turns talking to each other. It was true, right? Our version of actually doing something was actually just talking. We were just talking in protest cages while these people were just talking in their offices or just talking in their books they wrote. There's a lot of what we're doing in our time is talking. I'll actually tell a joke. I think I'll tell a joke, and then I'll end this. The opening remarks with a joke, and then we'll get to the super chats, because plenty of super chats to answer, and I'm happy to answer them. All right. The joke goes like this. There is a lawyer, and he has a dream. It says, decades of repression. Online left, another minute. Instead of class okay. Online left. Okay. All right. So the joke goes like this. The joke goes like this. There's a lawyer, and he has a dream. And in this dream, the voice of God says to him, you must hire a communist to work in your law firm. So he says, okay. He hires a communist to work in his law firm. He takes the communist to his office, the first communist he can find. He says, all right, I need you to sell the papers. All right, I'm sorry. He said, all right, I need you to file the papers here in my office. So he says, communist, file my papers. He goes away. He comes back at the end of the day. The communist is sitting there, and the papers have not been filed. And he says, why haven't you filed my papers? And the communist says to him, he says, we just defeated Donald Trump. The Republicans, they still have a lot of key governorships around the country, and maybe if we can completely defeat the Republicans, we can get Joe Biden reelected in 4 years, maybe then we can file the papers. But until then, we need to focus on defeating the right wing. We can't file the papers now. He says, are you kidding me? He says, get out of here. You must not be a real communist. So he goes to some local demonstration, and he finds two guys that are selling newspapers from two different communist groups. He says, okay, these guys must be real communists. I'm going to hire them to work at my law firm. So he hires them. He says, all right, guys. He said, here are my papers. File my papers. He goes away, comes back at the end of the day. The guys aren't there. He's like, what happened? And they're down on the street, and they've got his legal papers, and they're trying to sell them to people. And they're like, look, we just sold 3 of your papers. And look, we got phone numbers. We collected like $3 in money. He said, I didn't ask you to sell the papers. I asked you to file the papers. He said, oh, this is awful. This is awful. It's awful. He says, get out of here. So he finds another communist group. He says, maybe this communist group, maybe they can file the papers. So he says, takes them to his office. He says, here's the papers. Now file my papers. Goes away. He comes back. Well, the papers are still there, unfiled, but there's a leaflet on the table, and it says, rally in Times Square to file the papers. And he's like, oh, God, no. He goes to Times Square, and there's a group of communists there with picket signs, and they're chanting, file the papers, right? And then they have a Palestinian speaker get up, and the Palestinian speaker says, the fight for the Palestinians is also the fight to file the papers, and everyone applauds, yay! They have a transgender speaker gets up. The transgender speaker says, the fight of transgenderism is also the fight to file the papers. And everyone goes, yay! The speaker from Venezuela gets up. The fight to free Venezuela from imperialism is also the fight to file the papers. And everyone goes, yay! And he walks over to the communist he hired and he said, what's going on here? What is wrong with you communists? What is wrong with you? I just asked you to file the papers. Didn't ask you to have a rally in Times Square. Didn't ask you to sell my papers. Didn't ask you to sit around and do nothing and wait for the Republicans to just magically vanish. I just asked you to file the papers. Just file the papers. The person looks at him in a very angry look, says to him, how dare you, sir, how dare you compare me with those other communist groups? Those first 2 communist groups, they just talked about filing the papers. I'm the one who actually did something. So there you go. That's my little joke. What is this last super chat here? I'll write down. Is it hypocritical for anti-border wall, anti-police Democrats to push for a barbed? Okay. All right. Fence around the Capitol. All right. The Capitol. All right. That's my little joke. So at the end of the day, we need to file the papers. And filing the papers means getting to the broad masses of people with a socialist message. And getting to a situation where millions of working class Americans can realize the problem is capitalism. And the solution is a society where the banks, factories, and industries and major centers of economic power are organized to serve the people and public good and not the profits of a few. The answer is socialism. And the answer is not building little tiny isolated demonstrations. The answer is not selling newspapers. And the answer is not waiting on the Republicans to just vanish. The answer is getting to the broad masses of people. I've said this over and over again. We must get out of the movement and we must get to the masses. We need the American working people who are suffering to understand that that we need a government of action to fight for working families. And yeah, that's my opening remarks. So I hope I stimulated you all to think about how to communicate and how to engage with people. A little bit different than how I usually give my opening remarks, but that's okay. We're doing so many lives these days. We got to take things in different angles. So I want to thank everyone who was on the Zoom call for the Center for Political Innovation today. I want to thank everyone who's gotten a copy of the new book, the new CPI educational manual, We Are City Builders. I want to thank everyone who's done that. That's really great. I want to remind people, February 27th will be our next web conference here on this channel for the Center for Political Innovation. That is going to be really, really great. We're moving ahead, folks. We're doing good things. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. Be sure to hit the notifications bell. Post this on Reddit, post this on Facebook, post this on Twitter. I am going to take a drink of the unnamed orange beverage. And on that note, folks, I will call you out as I see you. Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? Names and locations. Names and locations. I will call you out. Balthazar in Oakland. Orange, Santa Clarita. I am not drinking a screwdriver. I don't drink alcohol. Chug. Okay. Alrighty. Kendall in San Diego. Washington State. Mike Lindell from My Pillow, Bulgaria. Bay Area, California. Mora, New York. Jeff, Detroit. Very, very good. Nassau County, New York. David in China. Chris in Baldwin Park, California. Montreal. Nassau County, Char Darling. Cincinnati, Jenny Lynn. Daniel in Los Angeles. Gateshead, England. Niles, Michigan. Wow. Adelaide, Australia. Ellie in London. Pennsylvania, USA. Forsyth, Missouri. West Palm Beach, JT24, Mississippi, John from the Upper West Side, California, Pomona, California, St. David's, Bermuda, Benton Harbor, Michigan. Right. Wow. I went to a few demonstrations for Reverend Pinckney from Benton Harbor, right? When he was a political prisoner, an advocate of the working class out in Benton Harbor. Brian Schaefer in Illinois. Fred Alameda in California. Long Island, New York. Max the Sax in the USSA. Virginia. Chris in Salt Lake City. Philly, San Diego. Dallas, Texas. What's going on here? All right. Under Crystal Lake, Nate from Australia, Los Angeles, Puragus, Russia, West Palm Beach, Massachusetts, Galen, North Carolina, Matt in Laos, the Rust Belt, Michigan, USA, Knoxville, Tennessee, Martin in Ireland, Brisbane, Australia, Cleveland Pirate Alex, PC USA, California, Ben in Toronto. Wherever I go, there I am, says Richard. Northern California, NYC, Heavy Dukes. Melbourne, Australia. Silicon Valley, Frank Naha. Quebec City, Canada. Bristol, Virginia. San Jose. Augusta, Michigan. Arnold Gonzalez in Texas. Incheon, Korea. Split, Croatia. London, where Marx is buried. Very good. Queens, New York City, socialist billionaire. Welcome, welcome. Auckland, New Zealand. Munich, Germany. Hello from northern lower Michigan. Chicago. Juan from Mexico. San Diego. Oshkosh, Wisconsin. Austin from Idaho. Michiganders unite. Jerry on some planet called Earth. Mario in Croatia. I'm here, the only place that matters. Born in the USSA. Joey from Belize. Austin from Massachusetts. Jeff from Grand Canyon National Park. I went there when I was a child and slept in a tent. Good times, good times, good times. Anybody else with us tonight? Anyone else want to give their name and location? Brooklyn, Wisconsin. Very good. I knew about Brooklyn, Ohio, near Cleveland. Now I know about Brooklyn, Wisconsin. Love from Minnesota. Thank you, Dystopian. Thank you for your dystopian love. Anybody else? Names and locations. Names and locations. Who is with us? Tent. Very good, Jeff. Jeff in the tent. Very, very good. Jeff in his tent. Who else is with us? San Diego, California in the house. Very good. We have such a great audience. This is great. So many people from so many different places. That's why I do this, by the way. No one's obligated. West Virginia, but I love it when people do, so people can know how big our audience is. This is really something special. This many people tuning in from so many different places. It is really amazing. It is really lovely. Watching in the tub, says Victor Serg. Carencio, Louisiana. We have a good crowd in Louisiana. Good crew of folks. UK, love from the UK. Communism in the future. West Virginia. I'm pouring more of this unnamed orange beverage. Very good. Very good. Folks, I love engaging with all of you. It's really fun. And thank you for letting me try something new. That was kind of an experiment tonight about talking about communication and Lower East Side, Manhattan. So very good, folks. Very good. Glad you were here for the roll call. All right. So we have a number of super chats, but keep them rolling in. Faramuk in Seattle. Keep the super chats rolling in. I'll keep answering them. This is how long the show keeps going. If you keep super chatting me, I keep going. There's sometimes I get very frustrated because the super chats just won't end, but that's okay. That's okay, right? We still got a pandemic here in New York. Restaurants are open, so I was able to chill for a little bit in a restaurant this afternoon after I exercised, but not anywhere I'm rushing to get to. We're still in pandemic lockdown, so I'm going to keep going. But yeah, keep the super chats rolling in. I'll keep answering you. So can workers align with small businesses? Yes, workers can align with small businesses. Yes, they can. Absolutely, they can align with small businesses. In fact, I think that it will be necessary to enter an alliance with them. And if you look at the socialist governments of the world today, like Nicaragua, like China, like Vietnam, like Cuba, part of their strength lately has been their ability to subsidize and create a layer of small businesses that are in alliance with the proletarian state. In Nicaragua, their program is a micro-entrepreneur program, it's called. It's very successful. They have this in Venezuela as well. And in Cuba, there's a new layer of small businesses. And that I think to some degree or other, small businesses, small profit-oriented institutions that are part of an overall centrally planned economy are necessary to some degree. I think it's better that they're cooperatives so that all the workers share in the profits. But at the end of the day, I think that there is some role for small businesses in socialism. But also, there should be an alliance between the proletariat and small businesses in our time, right? For example, infrastructure decaying in working class communities hurts small businesses. If the roads outside of the small business are crumbling, people ain't going to be able to drive there, right? If workers have better access to education, the workers at the small business, will be better educated, right? If national health care is provided, employers won't have to provide health care benefits to their employees, right? Instead, the state will provide it. So, strategic alliances with small business owners and the middle class are absolutely necessary, both in capitalist society and in a socialist society. I think some layer of small business owners, cooperatives, profit-oriented, tech start companies, there's some layer for small businesses. So absolutely. The Marxist concept of love. Wow. Wow. I'm not quite sure where to go there. People have relationships with each other. That exists. And there are all kinds of relationships, friendships, camaraderie develops. A comrade is different than a friend, right? A friend is somebody that you enjoy spending time with, you bond with, you have a connection with, you feel empathy towards. But a comrade is someone you struggle alongside, right? That is a particular relationship, camaraderie. And the relationship that communists have with each other is different than the relationship of a friend. Then there's also the romantic part, right? People that are in love with one another. And romance is something that is different than regular friendship, I would say, but it's also very different than camaraderie. Romance is when someone would like to form a family with somebody, get married to them, have them as their romantic partner. And romance is a little bit different than sex, right? Sex is mere bodily attraction, whereas there's something deeper about romance. It's more of an emotional connection, an intellectual connection. You become close to the person. None of what I'm saying here is particularly Marxist, I don't think. But yeah, I think love definitely plays a role. And, we need more love in the world. And there are different kinds of love. We need love in our communities. We need love in our workplaces for our coworkers. And solidarity between workers can be an expression of love. Che Guevara said that, and, it's funny, in my book on Kamala Harris, where I'm talking about I'm talking about the different motivations of people to become leftists and revolutionaries. I quote Sigmund Freud and his feelings of oneness, the oceanic feelings of oneness that people describe that Sigmund Freud just couldn't comprehend. So yes, I think that love is definitely something that plays a role in all of this. I hope that's a good Valentine's Day quotation for all of you. Prison reform advocates, absolutely. Look, the prison system is absolutely a disaster in the United States. It doesn't help the country in any way. It doesn't help the people who go through it. They don't become rehabilitated. There's a profit incentive to keep people locked up. Look, people shouldn't be in jail for using drugs. And in a lot of cases, there are people that might be in jail for violent crimes where, the prison system, obviously you have to respond to a violent crime. There has to be, some response to it by society, but the prison system is not really helping in the way that it responds to it. And that look, our prison system in this country is an absolute nightmare, and it doesn't help people, and it hurts communities. One thing that goes on is that in a lot of cases, prisoners are used as cheap labor, right? Instead of hiring private citizens that they have to pay a minimum wage to, there's a lot of companies that hire prisoners to do the labor of private corporations. And prisoners get paid like 2 cents an hour, right? They make military aircraft in federal prison. That's one thing that goes on. There are like aircraft factories in federal prisons. That's awful. There are prisoners answering our calls, call center workers. Instead of having call center workers from the wider society, they got prisoners answering people's calls in call centers, making like 2 cents an hour. It's awful. Prison labor is awful. It's one thing, if you're having prisoners do work, for the community, for the government, right? If you're having them make license plates or whatever. But when you're renting prisoners out to private corporations, that's just opening the door to exploitation, and it incentivizes. It's really awful. Read about the things that have gone on, prison labor, and we have a nightmare on our hands. We really do. And the American prison system must be completely overhauled. We need a whole new system, separating not just religion and the state, but also the market and the media. Separating market and media. Okay. Alrighty. The next question was Richard Mendhurst. Love his stuff. Anti-imperialist. I believe he's based in the UK. I believe he's Syrian himself. He talks about the evils of American imperialism. He's critical of the mainstream left. I think he's great. I'd love to go on his channel. He should have me on. I would love to talk with Richard Mendhurst. I would love to do it. Had a few friends who've gone on his channel before, and I like what he does, and I'm with him on Syria. I am an anti-imperialist, so yeah, I think he's great. He's retweeted me a few times. I've retweeted him a few times. I've never seen anything about him that I would denounce. He seems like a great guy, and he seems where I'm at politically. The fall of the USSR, was that because of the 1953 coup in Iran and the Iraq-Iran war? I don't see a direct cause there. There could be some links that one could make. I think that, the Iraq-Iran war was an absolute disaster. Two anti-imperialist states, the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Ba'athist Arab Socialist Republic of Iraq, fought each other. And over 1 million people died, and both states were significantly weakened, and the U.S. imperialists at various times maneuvered to support different sides. Now, a lot of people will say the Soviet Union was on Iraq's side, and it's true that the Soviet Union was selling Iraq weapons. However, the Soviet Union very much wanted to end the Iraq-Iran war. They were constantly trying to stop it. They wanted to end it because they were friendly to Iran, and they saw the Islamic Republic of Iran as an emerging anti-imperialist state, and they wanted to have a better relationship with it. So the Soviet Union, while they're widely described as being on Iraq's side, they wanted to end the war. The Iraq-Iran war was awful. The United States at first was arming and supporting Saddam Hussein, and then later, the United States seemed to, there was the whole Iran-Contra and Reagan, and there seemed to be some backhanded, offering of support for Iran, and it was a nightmare. Two anti-imperialist states fought each other, and it was a nightmare. It was an absolute nightmare, and the scars of that war are very, very well alive in Iran. I have been to Iran, and there are in every neighborhood in Iran, they have hanging in billboards the faces of all the martyrs who died in the Iraq-Iran war from that neighborhood. Still, right? And there's constant commemorations, and it's like that war never really ended. I mean, it's fresh in the minds of the Iranians, and they know very well. The Iranians know the United States supported Saddam Hussein, and the United States supported Saddam Hussein, and is widely. I mean, it seems like they gave Saddam Hussein chemical weapons to use against the Iranians. And the Soviet Union. I think they wanted to end that war, but they were supporting Iraq for the mostly they supported Iraq, but they kind of wanted to end it. They saw Iran as a potential ally. Yeah, I mean, the Iraq-Iran war was an absolute nightmare. And it's an example of really the strategy of Zbigniew Brzezinski, which was to manipulate anti-imperialists against each other. You talk about the Kampuchea War, where Pol Pot was used to attack Vietnam, right? He pretended to be a communist, but he was actually armed by the United States, and they provoked a war between Cambodia and Vietnam. And China ended up supporting Cambodia, and it was a nightmare. You can talk about what I talked about earlier about the Euro communists and all of this. That was the strategy, and that's the strategy that the Biden folks seem to be close with, right? The color revolution strategy of the Hillary Clinton State Department and Zbigniew Brzezinski, and it's this idea of like, let's have the USA look like it's being friendly and apologetic and retreating a little bit while we incite various communists and anti-imperialists against each other. We incite revolutions and uprisings in countries. And it seems like that Cold War liberal strategy. That's kind of what the Iraq-Iran war was the results of. I mean, Brzezinski and all of them are very sinister. People call them the more effective evil, right? That the neocons are definitely evil, but the neocon types they're so black and white in their thinking, and they're not strategic and manipulative. But the liberal CIA is much more strategic and manipulative in how they operate, and they're much more effective at maneuvering and causing problems. I find entrepreneurial small business pipe dreams to be the greatest obstacle to Marxist class consciousness in the USA. The ideological problem of libertarianism is the belief in individual success. Okay, we can talk about that. All righty. Should we advocate 21st century socialism and healthy trade with other countries or worldwide revolution? Well, obviously, we should advocate 21st century socialism and healthy trade with other countries. We should not, especially as people in the first world. We're the Americans, for goodness sakes. We can't be going to other countries and saying, oh, you should have a communist revolution. Obviously, we can't do that. Right? We can support progressive movements around the world. We can be anti-imperialist, but when we establish a socialist United States, we're not going to then start invading and spreading communism all over the world. That wouldn't be right. Right? We would instead have healthy trade relations. Yes, we want a 21st century socialist society. We want the dismantling of U.S. imperialism. We want a whole new economy where we trade with countries based on win-win cooperation. But no, the permanent revolution stuff, Trotskyism and his theory of permanent revolution, spreading chaos and violence all across the planet until every last king and capitalist is beheaded. That is wrong. That is not correct. Right? And that is an ultra-left, bloodthirsty fantasy that working people don't want. Working people want peace in their communities. Right? The world is going to move towards socialism, and it already is moving towards socialism. And if you look at what's happening, especially since this pandemic, how Vietnam and China and the socialist countries of the world, their economies have gotten so much better. It's very clear that the world is moving towards socialism, the Belt and Road, etc. But it's not going to move towards socialism at the barrel of a gun. It's not going to move towards socialism with leftists, especially Western leftists, trying to spread global revolution. It's going to move ahead with the socialist economics blocks of the world getting stronger, with the global economic system changing, with more countries moving towards socialism and establishing socialism. Clearly, worldwide revolution calls for worldwide working class revolution and stuff. That's not where we're at. That might have made more sense in the 1800s. It might have even made sense, in the time of the Bolsheviks. But nowadays, the way the world operates, we want socialism in one country, but we want internationalism. We want to offer friendship to different countries. We want to end imperialism and the economic system of imperialism. Alrighty, I don't know about this massacre in Taiwan. I'm going to have to look into it. I do know about the White Terror in Taiwan, and there was a lot of political repression in Taiwan of alleged communists. under Chiang Kai-shek, etc. But I'm going to have to look into that particular massacre. And also, I don't know about this particular law. I'm going to have to look up this PRO Act. It sounds very interesting. Absolutely. Sports under American socialism. Well, I think the opportunity of children and adults to engage in athletics should be greatly expanded. People should have the right and the ability to play sports. Look, I know it's funny. Noam Chomsky, he says that his mother became a Communist Party member because she wanted to play baseball, because the Communist Party had a baseball team. And she lived in Brooklyn in a low-income, working-class neighborhood, and the Communist Party in the 1930s had a baseball team. Well, he might be being a little bit disingenuous there, but that's true. The Communist Party in New York City did have a baseball team. And look, I think there's a role for sports in a socialist society. Absolutely. Sports provide entertainment. Sports, are a great thing. And, why wouldn't we have sports, right? Yeah, obviously there would be a need to a way to have athletic competition, right? And that socialist countries often pride themselves on people's athletic ability. If you look at Cuba and North Korea and countries like that, they take a lot of pride in how many of their people become successful athletes in boxing. North Korea has won a lot of medals in sharpshooting. And people used to joke about it, like when they would win a gold medal in sharpshooting in the Olympics. The North Korean sharpshooter will say, he'll come out and he'll say, Kim Il-sung told me to shoot as if I was aiming for the very heart of U.S. imperialism. And it's kind of funny. They take sports very seriously. Boxing is very popular in Cuba, I believe. Cuba has won many gold medals. And that, encouraging physical fitness is very important. I believe one of Mao's first published essays is on the importance of physical fitness, and why it's important to do exercises. And in a lot of Eastern countries, every school day begins with all the students in their uniforms exercising together in a mass body. And I think that's great. I think that's beautiful. And it builds kind of a group cohesion. They did that in Chinese schools. And Mao writes this essay that's called On the Importance of Physical Education. And he's kind of talking about how important it is to stay fit, but also how it's kind of a group building activity. And welcome, Ramiro. Glad you're with us. Thumbs up to you. That's Ramiro from Anticonquista, folks. He's in the chat. Just wanted to give him a shout out there. And, I think that, keeping physically fit, engaging in group exercise activities where people feel like they're part of a group, there's cohesion. That's very important. And that's why, Susan Sontag in her essay about fascism, she says that gymnastics are fascist, mass exercise and mass games are fascist, right? But this is illiberalism, right? People feeling like they're part of a group, like they're part of a community, a sense of oneness, right? And this is what socialism is trying to achieve. And so that's all very, very important. All right. Explain the not Trotskyite to neocon pipeline. Well, there's a lot there, but that's okay. We're not rushed at all, and I will talk to you about that. All right. So, the Trotskyite to neocon pipeline. Okay, so the United States, you have the Communist Party. It was formed in 1921. It's like 1919, there's different groups formed. They finally all merge into the official, bona fide Communist Party USA in 1921. The Soviet Union is changing, and in the Soviet Union, Stalin becomes leader of the Soviet Union. There's something in the Soviet Union led by Trotsky. It's called the left opposition. The left opposition. And the left opposition is led by Leon Trotsky. The left opposition loses. They're defeated. And so the Communist International decides to move against the left opposition. They also defeat what's called the right opposition, which is led by Bukharin in the United States. In the United States, the leader of the left opposition is a guy named James Cannon. James Cannon is the leader of the International Labor Defense. And James Cannon and Max Shachtman and Martin Aburn, that's three people, Shachtman, Aburn, and Cannon, they have a secret Trotskyite faction in the Communist Party. They're going around the Communist Party secretly trying to form some kind of underground Trotskyist group. They get caught. They get expelled from the Communist Party. So they're the Trotskyites, and they start, and immediately they start harassing the Communist Party. Going to the Communist Party offices and getting into fistfights with people and and there's, at first it seems like their main activity is like harassing the Communist Party, accusing Stalin of being a mass murderer, etc. But eventually, they start what's called the Communist League, and eventually they merge. There's a group of social democrats led by A.J. Musty, who's the leader of the American Workers' Party, and so they have the Workers' Party of America, and eventually they go into the Socialist Party and have a faction in the Socialist Party, and then finally, 1939, they start the Socialist Workers' Party, which is the big Trotskyite party in the United States. And they're maneuvering, and they're not a small grouping. The Trotskyites in the United States, they led in a very important strike in Minneapolis, the Teamsters Strike of 1934. And, it's funny because the Trotskyites, they, if you read The History of American Trotskyism by James Cannon, one of the problems that they had was that basically the memo got sent out that, hey, if you're somebody who doesn't get along with the Communist Party, you can join the Trotskyites. And all kinds of people, the Communist Party back then was, tens of thousands of people. So everybody who didn't get along with the Communist Party for whatever reason, anyone who had any falling out or personal disagreement, immediately became a Trotskyite. And because of that, they attracted a lot of, different people. And there was a lot of factionalism and James Cannon, he tells some funny stories about he wouldn't let a guy join because he wore a green felt suit or something. And it's because they were considered the other Communist Party, right? It's like if you're in the Communist Party, you don't get along, why you can join the other communists, which are the Trotskyites. They attracted a lot of very different people. One of the groupings that they tended to attract were academics. There were a lot of academics who didn't fit in with the Communist Party. The Communist Party, they were very rigid. They were very pro-Soviet Union. And for whatever reason, there are a lot of college professors who were interested in Marxism, interested in socialism, but didn't like the Communist Party and couldn't fit in with the Communist Party. So a lot of intellectuals joined the Trotskyites. Even though the Trotskyites, they had the Teamsters Union. They were very big in the Teamsters Union. Farrell Dobbs and Bill Brown and others, they were big in the Teamsters Union. But, they also attracted a lot of college professors. New York City became kind of the center of Trotskyism. I mean, New York City was the center of communism anyway. The Communist Party was very big in New York City. But there was a lot of Trotskyites in New York City. And, there were a lot of Trotskyite academics in New York City. Sidney Hook was a Trotskyite academic in this city. Who else was a Trotskyite academic here? I mean, a lot of different people. And a lot of, college professors and academics joined Trotskyism in New York City. And there was a guy, James Burnham, who was a philosophy professor. He joined New York City. James Burnham, a very famous professor. And there's just a whole bunch of academics and writers and kind of intellectuals who joined. All right. Should CPC... So the New York City wing of Trotskyism was a little bit different than the other wings of Trotskyism, right? In Minnesota, in Minneapolis, places like that, the communists, the Trotskyites, they did have labor union members, and they were considered more working class. New York City Trotskyism was considered to be a little bit weird. It was a world of college professors, world of academics, and there's actually there's a book that was published called The New York Intellectuals, which is a history of these people. Probably the most prominent leader of Trotskyism in New York City was a man named Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman had been in the Communist Party. He'd quit the Communist Party, been a Trotskyist, and he was the leader of New York City Trotskyism. Max Shachtman. If you look at him, there's pictures of him. He has a little tiny mustache. There's an old recording of him I found. I listened to a speech of him one time on the internet. Very good orator, and he's Max Shachtman. And so 1939, right? 1939. For those of you who've listened to this broadcast many times, I've sung you the obnoxious little song, Up in Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the fall of 39, there's a Russian and a Prussian riding up the party line. What was that song about? Well, that was a song Trotskyites wrote about the fact that in 1939, the Soviet Union, after having tried to build an anti-fascist alliance, and the United States wouldn't join with them, and They finally signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression pact of 1939 with Nazi Germany. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a non-aggression pact because the United States wouldn't sign a pact with them, because the British wouldn't sign a pact with them. In desperation, the Soviets signed the 1939 non-aggression pact with the Nazis in order to buy time. So that pact was signed. Immediately, a lot of these Trotskyites in New York City were not happy with that. They were already against the Soviet Union. But when that happened, Max Shachtman and James Burnham and others said that the Soviet Union was clearly no longer socialist. Trotsky maintained the Soviet Union was what he called a deformed workers' state, meaning that it had socialist economic foundations, but it was led by a parasitical Stalinist bureaucracy. Well, Max Shachtman and James Burnham and others said, no, the Soviet Union is not socialist. It is either state capitalist, which is what James Burnham said, or it's bureaucratic collectivist, which is what Max Shachtman said. That the Soviet Union, the Nazi-Soviet Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, UAE, Arabia economic system. That they're no longer socialist. They clearly can't be socialist. No socialist country would ever sign a pact with the Nazis, etc. There's a bureaucracy. The workers are not in power. It's this bureaucracy that's in power. That was their argument. And they had a very big split in the Socialist Workers' Party. And Trotsky wrote a whole book denouncing these people, the New York intellectuals, they were called. And it was a big split in the Socialist Workers' Party. And James Burnham and Max Shachtman and Martin Aburn were all expelled from the Trotskyist movement. They were kicked out of the Socialist Workers' Party. And they became known as the Shachtmanites. The Shachtmanites, right? And they started eventually the American Workers' Party, and that turned into the Independent Socialist League. And Max Shachtman was the leader of the Independent Socialist League. And what's interesting is that the father of neoconservatism, Irving Kristol, was also a member of the Independent Socialist League and the Workers' Party. He was a Shachtmanite Trotskyist. Irving Kristol, the father of Bill Kristol, the big thinker of neoconservatism, he was among the Trotskyists. And in his New York Times obituary, Irving Kristol, who was a Trotskyist, tells of how he stopped being a Marxist and how he became a conservative. All right. How he became a conservative. And the story that he tells is that he was drafted into the military. And he immediately had a negative opinion of the soldiers he was in the military with. He said he'd been an intellectual, but he'd never really dealt with the working class before. And he was very, very put off by the other soldiers. He didn't like the other soldiers in the military with him. And so based on that, he turned against socialism because he didn't want the workers to rule. But regardless, after World War II, Irving Kristol, who was still nominally a Trotskyist, he was hired by the CIA to start something called the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was a CIA operation where they covertly funded leftists. All right? It was the CIA started giving money to left-wing voices that were anti-Soviet. The people they generally gave money to were Shachtmanites. Okay, that's where it gets interesting. It was these followers of Max Shachtman that were heavily represented in Partisan Review magazine, and they were the left-wing voices that got propped up by the CIA. The CIA started giving money to the Shachtmanites. It started trusting the Shachtmanites and started giving them money to put out left-wing material that was anti-Soviet. Irving Howe, who went on to be a founder of DSA, he was a Shachtmanite. Irving Howe, Irving Kristol, there's many names. Hannah Arendt, Susan Sontag was never a Shachtmanite, but she hung out with this crowd. Partisan Review magazine, the CIA-funded magazine that started becoming like the voice of leftist criticism and leftist politics that was covertly funded by the CIA. It became heavily dominated by the Shachtmanites. Right? And, Irving Howe was a big Shachtmanite. And Irving Howe, he was this Marxist Shachtmanite, whatever. Irving Howe eventually had a big fight, and he was kicked out of the Shachtmanite group and just became a regular social democrat. He stopped being a Trotskyist. Irving Howe wrote an article where he said that being a Marxist and a socialist means that you're for the West against the Soviets, right? The Shachtmanites always said they were neutral. They were not for either the Soviet Union or the United States. Well, Irving Howe broke with the Shachtmanites and said he was for the United States. He was a faction in the Western war against Stalinism. And eventually, Shachtman dissolved his organization, and they stopped being Shachtmanites, and they all joined the Socialist Party. And the founder of DSA, Michael Harrington, was a follower of Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman was his mentor. He's dedicated his book Socialism to Max Shachtman. I keep hearing claims by Biden is in China's pocket. Okay, dedicated. His pocket, and I mean, a lot of Shachtmanites were key in setting up DSA. The Socialist Party collapsed in the early 70s. One faction of the Socialist Party became Socialist Party USA, and they were the pacifists that were against the Vietnam War. DSA was the faction that was kind of, Che quote, all right, writing it down. DSA was kind of against the Vietnam War, and there was a faction of the Socialist Party that was supporting the Vietnam War, and they became what's called Social Democrats USA. But, Irving Kristol is considered the ideological father of neoconservatism. A lot of the neocons also were associated with a philosophy professor named Leo Strauss, he'd fled Nazi Germany, and he was a professor at New School University in New York City, a philosophy professor who was kind of a mentor. And there was this crowd of people that were the New York City intellectuals that started out as Trotskyists, and then they got hired by the CIA, and they started getting jobs working for CIA-funded magazines. And then, over the course of the Vietnam War and all that, they were on the right. They were Republicans. Not all of them, right? Some of them just became Social Democrats and started DSA, but some of them became full-on Republicans, like Irving Kristol. Like James Burnham, for example. He became a Republican. Like Max Eastman. There were some of them that became full-on Republicans, and there were some of them that became Social Democrats or whatever. But it was this crew of people that started out as Trotskyites who broke with Trotsky over the Soviet Union, and then became CIA, aligned. And then over the course of the 1960s, they supported the Vietnam War. They thought that the anti-Vietnam War protesters were all Stalinists, and that ended up getting them into the neocon camp, right? There's a story of to what extent has China's crackdown on corruption been planned? Goodness gracious, you guys, a lot of China questions tonight. That's okay. China on corruption. Alrighty, so anyway, so there you go. That's kind of the pipeline. There's a couple things. Now, when the split in the Socialist Workers' Party happened, Trotsky wrote a book denouncing the New York City intellectuals, the ones who eventually became neocons. He wrote a book called In Defense of Marxism. That's where he makes the case the Soviet Union is still a workers' state. Meanwhile, James Cannon, who was the head of American Trotskyism, he wrote a book, and I've read both of these books. He wrote a book called The Struggle for a Proletarian Party. And the struggle for a proletarian party is like the inside story of the split. And you read that, and it's very clear that there was a lot of difference, okay? There's some weird anecdotes about the New York City Trotskyites, the New York intellectuals. For example, people described their meetings as being like group therapy, kind of. That their meetings were very different, right? The most Socialist Workers' Party meetings would be, agitational speeches about socialism and classes on Marxist books. That the New York intellectuals, there was a very moralistic tone to a lot of what they're doing. Like they would have a class where they would discuss, like, what if someone in our group had committed a class crime and was a strikebreaker, and we heard about it? Should we report them to the leadership of our group or not? Would it be the right thing to do to report on our member if they had broken the rules? And they would have these like intellectual moralistic kind of arguments. And instead of, having their meetings structured with speakers and studying Marxism, it was more like kind of group therapy atmosphere and like wrangling about questions of philosophy. And that they were always kind of seen as they were a little bit wealthier than most of the other Trotskyites. Um, and yeah, I mean, they were a little bit more middle class, and they were just a little more, they were more hostile to the Soviet Union, obviously. That was the ultimate thing that did them in. And they were just this grouping, and they were centered around New School University. Um, and they were the New York intellectuals. And those are the folks that eventually became the neocons. I think Gene Kirkpatrick was around them. And yeah, that's the trot to neocon pipeline. Some people try to find continuity in the neocons' belief in they want to spread democracy around the world with revolutions, and Trotsky's belief in permanent revolution. That's wrong. All right, I mean, there's not continuity there really. There's some continuity on the left, right, with the Hillary Clinton State Department and stuff. There's a hijacking of that revolutionary middle class energy, the revolutionary intelligentsia, but really there's no continuity there. I think ultimately it's a lot about economics, right? That these are people that, when they first came to the United States, they first got off the boat, they were working class. They were poor working class people, right? From Lithuania and Russia and Romania and Poland and places like that. They were hungry and starving, and they joined communist groups to fight for their rights. There you go. And then their kids, went to college and got degrees and became professors. And their class outlook changed. I think that's really more of what it's about than anything. Sheldon Wolin and John Ralston Saul agreed that a professional revolutionary class modeled after Lenin's disciplined Bolsheviks is a prerequisite. All right, we'll talk about that. Okay. So that's really what there is there. It's a certain milieu of people, the New York intellectuals, and not all of them went to the right. The organization in the United States that probably had the most roots in this wing of Trotskyism for a long time was the ISO, the International Socialist Organization. And they would get very angry if you would ever point this out. Because Max Shachtman, in the final years of his life, Max Shachtman supported the Vietnam War, and he supported the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was pretty awful. But, the ISO were the Shachtmanites. The ISO were the independent socialist clubs of Berkeley. And when Max Shachtman threw in the towel and joined the Socialist Party, they stopped supporting Max Shachtman, and they teamed up with Tony Cliff, who was a leader of British Trotskyism. But the ISO was basically the Shachtmanite organization, and they don't want you to know that. And now they've dissolved. They're in DSA now as a faction. But for years, the International Socialist Organization, I think in Britain and Australia, they're known as the Socialist Workers' Party. They were Shachtmanites for many, and that they were the continuity of the Shachtmanite organization. And they were considered to, in a lot of ways, be kind of like this as well. That they were very middle class, very much on the campuses, very moralistic. So yeah, I mean, that's neoconservatism. All right. Okay. Socialists building communities, and I think that's great. I think socialists should definitely be living together, pooling their resources, learning to depend on each other, learning to work together, doing activism together, doing outreach. I think that's great. I am not opposed to that at all. Obviously, you want to be smart about how you do it. With any living situation, you're going to have rules that you follow, and you're going to have certain expectations, and you're going to have to share the costs, together and such. But I think socialists living together and having intentional communities is a good thing, but it's not the answer, right? It's a way of helping facilitate activism. When people are living together, it's a way of, concentrating your forces. It's a way of keeping track of each other. It's a way of, keeping, everyone on the same page, and it's a way of, organizing effectively. I think people living together is a good thing. But that in and of itself, it's not like, oh, we're going to live together and be communists together. No. I mean, you're living together in a capitalist society. You're living together as a way to effectively be activists against capitalism. But you're not going to build communism in one apartment, okay? You're not going to build communism in one apartment building or in one neighborhood. You're not going to do that. Right? So I'm all for socialists living together as an effective way to organize together, as an effective way to facilitate each other. Look, for years, not anymore, for years, I would always, it always seemed I had some, like, a long-term house guest, right? When I was living in New York City, I almost always had somebody, some socialist activist sleeping on my couch or sleeping on my floor. And they would give me a little bit of rent here and there, but I didn't mind. I enjoyed the company. I was not married at that point. I was a single guy. And, at one point I had an apartment out in Queens, and it seemed like there was always two or three socialists sleeping in that apartment from different cities, or they were, activists during Occupy Wall Street. A lot of occupiers were sleeping on my floor and sleeping in my, there were many times many people were staying over at my place. And at one point I did live in a basement. I spent a summer, about a year actually. I lived in a basement with four other people, and very close confines. Not much privacy. We hung up we had what do you call it? Like sheets that we hung up as like curtains to give privacy. But at one point, we had five socialists living in a basement together, and we did that, and that was an amazing experience, honestly. And again, when you're living with other people who share your political views, it makes you concentrate more, right? And it kind of gives a unique flavor to your activism. So I would never want to compel anyone to do that. No one should do that against their will. No one should be pressured into doing that kind of thing. But, socialist living together is a good thing. But don't think that I'm saying that's what socialism is. We're not going to build socialism by starting a utopian commune. That's not how it's going to happen. But, socialist living together, having, communal living arrangements, I think is a good thing. I think it's a very good thing. All right, cool. Is a one-party state needed? No. You'll have to remember the Russian Revolution, they didn't want to have a one-party state. Originally in the Soviet Union, there were three political parties. There were the left Mensheviks and the left Socialist Revolutionaries and the Bolsheviks, right? There were three legal political parties. All three of those parties recognized the Soviet Constitution. The Menshevik Party didn't, but there was a split from the Mensheviks called the left Mensheviks, and they supported it. And then the Social Revolutionary Party didn't, but there was a split from the Social Revolutionary Party called the Left Social Revolutionary Party, and they supported it. Originally, the Soviet Union had three parties, and it wasn't until the Civil War, and both of those parties kind of became organizing centers for counter-revolution, and ultimately, a member of the Left Social Revolutionary Party shot Lenin, and because of all of that, eventually the Bolsheviks were the only party, and then eventually the Bolsheviks outlawed factions in their own party. But that wasn't done because they wanted it. It was done because that was forced on them by the circumstances. They were invaded. They were attacked. They were, they were forced to become a very militarized society and become more and more authoritarian. And that's how that worked. And in China, again, they tried to have. They have, even still today, they have very, very small representatives of other parties. There's the left KMT, it's called, the people from the KMT who came over to support Mao. There's something called like the Peasants Party. And they're very small parties and they're irrelevant. But originally, the reason it's the People's Republic of China was it was a people's democratic, government. And the idea was that it would be a coalition of all the anti-Japanese and anti-imperialist forces, right? In North Korea, the Korean Workers' Party is not the Communist Party of Korea. It is a merger of the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party of Korea and the Christian Party of Korea. They all merge into one called the Workers' Party. I missed a super chat. What did I miss here? Going up, 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 going up. What did I miss? What did I miss? What did I miss? I don't think I missed I wrote that down. I wrote that down. Bolshevik Party. I wrote that down. I didn't miss anything. Don't scare me like that. All right. Yeah. But, the need for a one-party state. I don't think the one-party states emerge when countries are under attack. They emerge when countries are under attack and they're forced to tighten up by rigidity. Venezuela has multiple parties, right? There's the Patriotic Pole in Venezuela, which is all the parties that support Maduro. And that's a good thing. And there's the Patriotic Pole, and Nicaragua has different parties. I don't think that a one-party state is necessary. And I mean, one-party states do emerge as a result of material conditions. But I don't think that there's any sacred thing about a one-party state. I don't think that anyone should advocate, after the revolution, we must have a one-party state. I'm not sure I agree. I don't agree with that. Read, Caleb, read. What am I supposed to read? Like, what's going on? No, I mean, I don't. So there you go. Obviously, I think that the working class can have different parties. So there you go. All righty. All right. Would a $15 minimum wage harm small businesses? No, because it's not only the employees of the small businesses, you have to remember. It's not only the employees of the small business who will have their wages go up, it'll be all the other minimum wage employees in the community. And small businesses, not only do they have employees, they also have customers. They also have customers. If all the people in the community who make minimum wage suddenly have more money, they're going to buy more from the small business. Think about that. I didn't miss that super chat. I just don't know enough about that law to comment. Anyway, I said that. I don't know enough about that law to comment. But $15 an hour minimum wage, yes. Will they have to pay their minimum wage employees more? Yes. However, so will all the other businesses. And so will the big businesses. And then the small business that needs customers, the people in the community will have more to spend. Furthermore, the tax revenue of the community in terms of sales tax will go up. And as a result, the infrastructure of the community will expand. Like the person who says that the $15 an hour minimum wage hurts small businesses is only looking at one narrow aspect. It will hurt small businesses in that small business owners will have to pay more wages to their employees. That's true. But that is not the only factor. Paying wages to employees is not the only thing small businesses do. They sell products. They exist in a community. And if the community has more money overall, that's beneficial to a small business. This is one of the things, okay? There's all this talk about, we got to have tax cuts for the rich. If we have tax cuts for the rich, they'll spend more money. No. Rich people spend money. The people that are millionaires and billionaires, their spending does not change. They spend what they feel like spending. They only invest their money to make a profit, right? They invest their money when they can make a profit on it. But working class people, if your income went up, if your income doubled, would your spending increase? Absolutely it would, right? Because you're a working class person, as am I. If we get more money, we're going to spend more money. And that increases the growth rate in the community. So if working class people in your community, if in your city, every worker who is now making less than $15 an hour suddenly got $15 an hour, if that happened, Germany and France following, all right. Okay. Okay. Every worker in that community, got $15 an hour more. That would mean that small business is very likely to start selling a lot more of its products, number one. That would also mean that the rate of growth in the community itself would expand, meaning there would be more prosperity in the community, more money going around in the community. That's going to benefit any small business owner. Overall, it would be beneficial to a small business owner to have the people in their community with more money to spend, right? When working people have money, they spend it. So when working people's wages go up, working people spend more money. And that is good for small business owners. So it is bad for them in one very narrow sense, but in the fact that it puts more spending money into the community overall, expands the rate of growth in the whole community. They're likely to start selling more products. There's going to be more prosperity in the community overall. It will benefit small business owners. I think I've made my point. I hope that's helpful, by the way. Teresa, I hope I helped answer your question. All right. Is Maduro suppressing the communists? Well, look, I know that Maduro has been very friendly to the Communist Party of Venezuela. He's spoken at their conferences. He's very friendly to them. I also know that, that there are when I was in Venezuela, a lot of local officials in the PSUV are also communist party members, and it's complicated. I also know, however, the Communist Party did, unfortunately, they did, like, run a candidate against the PSUV. They didn't endorse the United Socialist Party in the last election, and that there's some feelings that the Communist Party in Venezuela might be moving in kind of an ultra-left direction. There's elements in the Venezuelan Communist Party that talk about Chinese imperialism and Russian imperialism, and, and so it's complicated, okay? If you, look, I mean, if you were a serious socialist, right? If you were just a young Venezuelan or a Venezuelan and you just wanted a better Venezuela and you thought socialism was the way to do it, would you join the Communist Party or would you join the PSUV? Obviously, you would join the PSUV because one is the party ruling the country. One has got millions of members and youth leagues and, militias and the PCV is this remnant of the Cold War. So, based on that, based on the fact that if you're a Venezuelan revolutionary who just wants a better Venezuela and believes that socialism is the way to do it, you're going to join the PSUV. So the Communist Party is starting to attract elements that are that kind of permanent opposition, that kind of naysayer, opposition. And that's always the problem that you develop, right? And that's a danger. And that, Chavez urged the PCV to merge into the United Socialist Party. The best elements in the Venezuelan Communist Party did. And unfortunately, a lot of the elements that are still in the Communist Party have more of a sectarian bent to them, and that's not good. George Carlin and how he might react to today's George Carlin, okay. All right. Reacting to today's events. All right. So there you go. All right. Next question. Is the online left the result of decades of propaganda? Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, the online left, I don't know. You get people on the internet, you can tell they just don't know anything about Marxism. They're very new to it, but there's a very know-it-all-ish quality. Video I made, they said, that's almost as dumb as saying that Mao should align with... Are we back? Wow, this is wild. It's giving me internet. It's letting me resume, though, which is a good thing. I guess I'm still here, so it's buffering. Wow, that was weird. But anyway, these people have tweeted at me like, you're so dumb, you would have thought Mao should align with Chiang Kai-shek. Mao did align with Chiang Kai-shek. Mao was in the KMT government, and then after that, Mao aligned with Chiang Kai-shek to fight Japan. So that's, like, dumb, right? And that there's a lot of, like, people, these are very, very new to this stuff, but they're very, very emotional. They're looking for catharsis, and it's kind of like what I talked about at the beginning about the isolation that develops, and, people have their own little world and their own little sub-universe. It's problematic, and that everyone wants their pain to be heard, right? Everyone, they want to say, I want to hear my pain. I want a validation of my pain. And that's kind of what, AOC is doing with her, her trauma thing, right? She wants the whole world to know her pain. Well, we do, and that's a problem, right? And it's like, it stops being about actually accomplishing anything, actually building any real alliances. Instead, it turns into, I want the world to validate my feelings. And, that's okay. People need to have their feelings validated. That's what friends do with each other. When you're having a bad day, you call up one of your friends and say to them, hey, I'm having a bad day. And your friend listens to you and validates your feelings and then maybe gives you some advice or whatever, right? That's part of life. That's how social life works. That's not how political life works. Political life is very different than social life, right? If you actually want to accomplish something, it's not about validating everyone's feelings. It's about, forming united fronts. And, sometimes you have to work with people who, you don't agree with about everything. You have to be able to work with people politically and understand their flaws, right? And say, well, you know what? I don't agree with you about this, but I'm willing to work with you around this. And that, and you have to decide what's really important. What's really important, right? I went on a call about Yemen. And it was, there were people on that call about Yemen from the UK that were from the Workers' Party. I love the Workers' Party, Galloway and Jyoti Brar and others, but there were also people on that call that were conservatives, and that's okay with me because I want to stop the war in Yemen. And, I don't necessarily agree with everything that Galloway and Jyoti Brar and others say, and they don't agree with everything that I say. And I especially don't agree with conservatives, but I want to stop the war in Yemen. And if I did the internet thing, the cancel culture thing, where it's like I examine everyone's political views, and if there's one person on that call who's transphobic, or one person on that call who one time said something anti-Semitic, oh no, I'm not going to be seen with one of those. Oh no, 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 no. I mean, come on, folks. Come on. Come on. We gotta get over this, right? We gotta get over this. When I went to Iran, I went to Iran, and that was about, going to conferences against Israel and against American imperialism. I was in the room with people that are wildly different than I am politically. People who wouldn't be caught dead next to me politically. I was in the same room with them in Iran, and I was on airplanes with them in Iran, and I was with them in buses in Iran, and that was very good for me. It was very good for me. It was very, very good for me to realize that, like Iran is struggling against imperialism. Israel wants to destroy the Iranian people. Imperialism, imperialism is the enemy here. And these are people that politically are nowhere near where I'm at, but, we're against the imperialists, and, we want to stand in solidarity with the Iranians against imperialism. And so, we're both Americans, and we're politically not on the same page, but we're going to be in the van together. We're going to be on the airplane. We're going to be civil to each other. It's important, right? This is important. Look, it's part of like growing up, right? Again, it's kind of like I talk to people about kindergarten communism, right? And this is kind of an extension of that, right? I've many times explained to people, when you're in kindergarten, you learn the colors, right? This is orange, this is green, this is purple. You learn the numbers, 1, 2, 3. And then a lot of people, when they're very new to communist politics, they kind of have the same approach. That is communist. That is reformist. That is Trotskyist. That is a real socialist country. That is not a real socialist country. That is true Marxism, Leninism. That is revisionism. That is this. That is that. That is... And that is not serious thinking, right? That is kindergarten communism. You got to start there. You got to learn the basics. But then when you actually start applying this in the real world, you got to get beyond that. You can't just point to something and say, that is what it is. It's not just a vocabulary lesson, right? You have to understand different forces in the world. You have to understand what side you're on. You have to understand what contradictions are primary and what is secondary. You have to understand what matters and what doesn't, right? You have to understand what alliances are necessary, right? These are things that are very important, right? And that when people just walk around, this is right, they're not getting it. They're not getting it. Socialist Europe look like? They're not getting it. So there you go. Oh, and that's, we have to be able to, sit down with people with whom we don't agree. And we have to be able to sit down with people we agree about some things and not with other things. Look, the Nation of Islam is an amazing group of people. I have a very high opinion of the Nation of Islam. Minister Louis Farrakhan, I spent a lot of time with the Nation of Islam in Iran. I've been quoted in the Final Call newspaper, which I'm very honored as a white man to be quoted in a revolutionary black newspaper. That is a great honor for me. I have a very high opinion of the Nation of Islam. But do they agree with me? Nope. Are they Marxists? Nope. Are they a group that has anything to say to white people? Nope. Are they my religion? Nope. I'm not a Muslim, and their views are not really very in line with mainstream Islam. They have their own very specific beliefs. That's fine. I really respect the work the Nation of Islam does in the black community, and they are anti-imperialist to their core. They've built a core of dedicated people who are anti-imperialists and are trying to raise up the black community. And, I think what the Nation of Islam has done in the black community is amazing. Right? It's really amazing that there's an organization that can get 1 million people, the 1 Million Man March. They can get hundreds of thousands of people to come out to their demonstrations. They are anti-imperialists. They support, China, they support Venezuela, they support Russia, they support Iran. They are, they are they are sympathetic to Cuba. And they do amazing work, and they care for their people, and they live together, and they have schools, and they have their ideology, and they are very disciplined. And the Nation of Islam is an amazing group. Are they communists? No, they are not communists. Okay, but I respect them, right? And I would love to be able to be in some kind of united front with the Nation of Islam at some point, right? I imagine if there was ever a revolutionary situation in the United States, and there was some kind of revolutionary government that was emerging, the Nation of Islam would be very well represented in it, I'm sure. Now, I would never join the Nation of Islam, and they wouldn't want me to join because I'm a white guy. But, if the black community was in motion and fighting for its rights and well organized, the Nation of Islam is going to be a big factor in that. And does that mean I approve of everything they say? No, they say a lot of things about Jews I don't approve of. They say a lot of things about the LGBT thing that I really don't approve of. I certainly don't share their religious beliefs, but I see them as a revolutionary force in the black community, a revolutionary anti-imperialist force in the black community, and because of that, I respect them. So there you go. All right. Is the fence around the Capitol hypocritical? You're saying, first of all, the question was, are the Democrats who are anti-police and anti-border wall hypocritical because of the fence around the Capitol? Well, the Democrats are not anti-police, and they're not anti-border wall. Right? In fact, Joe Biden, in his, there's videos of Joe Biden calling for a border wall long before Trump did. Democrats are certainly not anti-police. Kamala Harris, she locked up more people of color than anybody else. She was the best friend of the police. She worked against abolishing the death penalty. She had a long record of protecting cops from prosecution. I wrote a whole book about Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is not anti-cop. She likes to go to Black Lives Matter rallies and do photo ops, and she's written this autobiography to try to present herself as anti-police. She is not anti-police. Joe Biden, the guy who authored the crime bill, is he anti-police? No. Right? The Democrats, there's a huge energy around Black Lives Matter, and so they like to take pictures at it, and so does Mitt Romney, and so does a lot of people. But no, the Democrats are not anti-police. Meanwhile, the Democrats are no friend to the immigrant community. They've set up a guest worker trap program. They haven't been calling for legalization of the immigrant community. They don't like the symbolism of the border wall, but they're not friends of the immigrant community. They've supported a lot of anti-immigrant legislation. So on top of that, and then they have a wall around the Capitol. Well, they have a wall around the Capitol. They're creating an atmosphere. I actually do think they need to get the military occupation of the Capitol and the wall. It's about creating an atmosphere of fear, and it's about creating this hysteria. Right? What happened on January 6th was awful, but it's about creating this hysteria and this fear in order to get through what the Democrats want. Right? The idea is we're supposed to be so shaken up by what Donald Trump did that we salute the Democrats, right? And that's basically what a lot of the synthetic left are saying right now. Oh, look, the Republicans are so bad. Trump is so bad because of January 6th. You're not allowed to criticize AOC. You're not allowed to force the vote because look what happened. And it's the military occupation of D.C., in my opinion. Obviously, there are security concerns, right? I'm not saying there aren't security concerns, obviously, January 6th. But I think that there is an effort on the part of the Democratic administration to create a kind of militarized with us or against us atmosphere. And that's what the ongoing huge fence and military occupation is about. They want to keep that going as long as they can. This is like their 9/11. After 9/11, Bush, he had the orange alert and the yellow alert and the green alert and the purple alert and and when you create an atmosphere like that, it favors the authority. Okay? And that's what they're trying to do. I think the Democrats very much want to milk January 6th for all it's worth, right? Look how bad the Republicans are, which they are. I'm not denying that they are. Trump was awful and the Republicans are awful, but they're trying to milk it for what it's worth, keep an atmosphere in Washington, D.C., no protests, no demonstrations, everybody on edge. That's what they're doing. All righty. But no, the Democrats are not anti-police and they're not pro-immigrant. So there you go. separating the market and the media. Well, look, in Venezuela and in Russia and in many countries around the world, the government plays a role in creating opportunity for media. There's a lot of government funding for media. In the United States, we have PBS. They get some government money. They get a lot more private money from, foundations and stuff. But no, I mean, the idea of creating community media, setting up community radio stations in neighborhoods and giving working people access and having it so not only is market media out there, but having, state-funded, community-controlled media. State funded, yes, but community control, where working class people can apply to have like a hobby radio show or something. Having something like that, there needs to be more of that. And I saw that in Venezuela. I went into neighborhoods where there were radio stations where, local people could apply to get a show, and they had a show. And that, opening up access to the airwaves to working class people is a very important thing, and that socialist states need to do that. All right. Progressive Democrats, anti-police, and pro-immigrant. Okay. That's okay, folks. I appreciate the super chats. Progressive Dems, anti-police, pro-immigrant. Okay. Okay. Alrighty. Next question. Libertarianism and the idea of individual success. Well, look, I wrote a whole book called Getting Rich Without Capitalism. It's a book that I published about that whole issue. We need working people to understand that socialism will make them rich. Capitalism is the reason they are getting poorer. And if we had a centrally planned economy where the banks, factories, and industries were organized to serve public goods and not profits, and there was an oversight and central planning, and it wasn't the chaos of the market, the ability for average working people to see their living standards expand, that would greatly increase, right? If the state was planning out production, and the major industries and the major banking systems and the banks and the major industries and healthcare and all that was run by the state, right? Then the ability of average people to start their own businesses and become wealthy would expand. And the ability of working people to have a more prosperous life and see their living standards go up would expand. We need to get out of this idea that socialism is about making people poor. It is not about making people poor. It's not about dividing up things equally. Socialism is about having rational control of the means of production. It's about eradicating a system where production is carried out for profit, and having a system where growth is no longer restrained by the irrationality of the market. That's why I wrote a whole book addressing this question called Getting Rich Without Capitalism, directed at working class people who want their living standards to go up, right? And the whole book was written for libertarians. My goal is that someday libertarians will see that book on the shelf and go, getting rich without no, you can't do that. And they will open the book and open their eyes. That's why I wrote the book. The slogan of Huey Long, the great socialist from Louisiana, Huey Long, the progressive leader, never called himself a socialist, but, he was basically advocating and basically created a state-run economy in Louisiana that was broken up after his death. Huey Long said, "Every man a king, but none shall wear a crown." So there you go. All right. Should the Chinese Communist Party abandon atheism? I don't know. It's up to them. I mean, there is a lot of religion in China. There's Christianity in China. There's Islam in China. There's Tibetan Buddhism in China. There's other Buddhism in China. Confucianism is on the rise, and the Chinese Communist Party has been playing up the idea that Confucianism is important. So I mean, I don't know. I don't know. The Chinese Communist Party can make whatever decision they want in regards to religion. Not for me to say. What is the economic system of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia? Well, I've used this many times. That system in United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia is what you can call state capitalism. State capitalism. A lot of people will say the Soviet Union was state capitalist. No, it wasn't. So, China is state capitalist. No, it's not. State capitalism is when you have a system where the state is very, very, very heavily involved in carrying out production for profit. Capitalism is production for profit. Socialism is production for public good. Let me repeat this. Capitalism is production for profit. Socialism is production for public good. If the banks, factories, and industries are involved in production to make a profit for their owners, that's capitalism. If the banks, factories, and industries are involved in production for the benefit of society, that's socialism. Okay? So, again, the worker cooperatives thing. If we just had a bunch of worker cooperatives, are those worker cooperatives trying to make profit? That's capitalism. However, Soviet Union, banks, factories, and industries were organized according to a central plan. The surplus created was shared by society. Bureaucrats got a bigger share than average working people. That's true. There was a bureaucracy. But it was not production organized for profit. They didn't sit there and it was not organized for profit. The economy was not organized for profit. China. Chinese Communist Party controls the economy. There's a lot of profit-making institutions, but there's this huge entity called the Chinese Communist Party, this huge apparatus of government-run banks and industries that forces the economy to serve public good and not profits, not capitalism. Saudi Arabia. The government runs pretty much all of the economy in Saudi Arabia. No question about it. But does the government of Saudi Arabia organize the economy for public good? No. The government of Saudi Arabia organizes the economy to make profits for the Saudi royal family that owns it. It's state-organized capitalism. And that's what the United Arab Emirates has. And there's a lot of developing countries around the world. Myanmar, right? Myanmar, it's state capitalism, right? There are certain families that... Singapore, state capitalism, right? The state is heavily involved. The government is very involved. It's not laissez-faire at all. But the economy functions to make profits for a group of owners. And the state heavily facilitates that. That's capitalism. Water issues, India, China. Okay. So, yeah, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates is a great example. And, after World War II, Britain, they nationalized a lot of industries after World War II. But was Britain ever a socialist country? No. No, it was not. India, China, water issues. Alrighty. So there you go. Alrighty. Is the Chinese Communist Party democratic centralist? Yes, it is. They have strict democratic centralism. People get expelled all the time, and their fights are internal. You will not find, public statement. They're not factions publicly. I'm sure there are people in the Chinese Communist Party who don't agree with each other, but you don't know about it. They have a public face to the masses. The Chinese Communist Party is definitely a democratic centralist organization. They have President Xi Jinping, who represents the entire party. There are people in the Chinese Communist Party that I think are probably to the left of Xi Jinping. There's people in the Chinese Communist Party that are to the right of Xi Jinping. You don't hear about it, right? There's one face to the masses of the Chinese Communist Party. 90 million members, but there's one party line. Well, that's democratic centralism for you. So, yeah, I would say the Chinese Communist Party is definitely a democratic centralist organization. All right. Is Biden in China's pocket? No. He's watering down some of the Trump hostility. He seems to have de-escalated some of it. He's not as blatantly hostile as Trump was, but it may just be the words. Ultimately, not many of the policies have changed. The trade war still seems to be in effect. So I don't see Biden as being in China's pocket. I really don't see that. He's the government of Myanmar. He's immediately declared it a coup, even though it's a pro-China entity. He's talking about Uyghurs. He's talking about all kinds of stuff. A lot of the trade war stuff hasn't been restricted, hasn't been rolled back. And yeah, it's a different approach. I think he wants to expand U.S. influence in China. I don't think he wants to just build a wall and cut them off. I think he wants to expand U.S. influence. So it's different, but it's a different approach. But ultimately, I think he's anti-China, yes. What was the quote from Che Guevara? He said, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, revolutionaries are motivated by great feelings of love. So that's the quote from Che Guevara I've always heard. For Valentine's Day, you can quote Che Guevara, at risk of sounding ridiculous, revolutionaries are motivated by great feelings of love. All righty. How much was the China crackdown on corruption planned, etc.? Well, look, there's a big problem with corruption in China. Big problem with it. And in order to keep the Chinese Communist Party clean and make sure that it doesn't just become, cash and carry where local officials are taking bribes from capitalists, in order to assert the community control and make sure that it's not, in bed with all the local capitalists as they're trying to crack down on this new capitalist class that has emerged. there's a crackdown on corruption. Now, they don't talk to me about it. I'm just a guy in the United States. I've never been to China, right? So they don't, I don't know what's planned and what's not and all that. But I think the crackdown on corruption is a very good thing because corruption is bad. And the Chinese Communist Party shouldn't be in bed with big corporations. It should be representing the Chinese working class and the Chinese people and controlling the big corporations on their behalf. And so making sure that there aren't Communist Party officials that are, on the take and taking bribes and stuff. I think that's good. I think it's a very good thing. All right. Someone said that a party of new type is needed, like the Bolsheviks is needed. Well, yes, you need people who give the whole of their lives to revolution. And you need those people to work in coordination with each other. Absolutely. So on the surface, I agree with that. However, what does that look like, right? Is the model that Lenin put forward in his book, What is to be Done? Is that the model that a party in our time should use? Maybe. I mean, there are things we can learn from that, but democratic centralism, the different strategies that are put forward, agitation, propaganda. I mean, there are different conditions in our time. I mean, the agitation propaganda thing where you propagate, you only really preach communism to the most advanced, and instead the masses you just agitate. Well, nowadays, look, people can Google people. People are literate, right? When Lenin wrote that book, most of Russia's population was illiterate. It was only the very educated folks that were engaging with these ideas and reading books and such, right? And that the idea where we're just going to agitate to the broad masses and stir up some kind of confrontation, but we'll find smart, revolutionary people and we'll teach them communism. Well, no. Now I think there's a need to teach the broad masses communism, right? I mean, I think that that's the problem in our time is we need to teach the broad masses of people about, our ideas. So this idea of only educating or propagating to the advanced and just kind of agitating the masses, I think is very outdated. But, obviously some kind of organization of people who give the whole of their lives to the revolution, who are fanatical. Look, there's always rooms for fanatics. Look, the day you stop being a fanatic, in my view, is the day of your spiritual death. Okay? My hope for everyone on here is that you can be a fanatic. Because that is, when you find something that you truly love, and you believe in it, and you work hard for it, you're a fanatic. And that is what the joy in life is finding something you believe in, finding something you're dedicated to, and working. Okay. Working toward it. All right? That is my hope for all of you is that you'll find something you believe in and work toward it. So there you go. So yeah, I think we need a group of fanatical socialists, and I think those people need to coordinate their activities. So in that sense, there you go. All right. Germany and France banning CGTN. Awful. Absolutely awful. Absolutely awful, right? And, there should be CGTN in Germany and France, just like there should be French 21 and, Der Spiegel and this is bad for the world. French and German people should be able to hear what China has to say. China should be able to hear what French and German people have to say. This is bad for the world. People need to be communicating. Different views and perspectives need to be available. It's a nightmare. George Carlin reacting to today's events. Well, he's a comedian. George Carlin's very funny. Look up his stuff, and it's often very class-conscious stuff, right? A lot of his routines. He likes to play with language, but he has a lot of, class-conscious routines. He talks about war, propaganda. He talks about corruption and rich people and how they're making us all stupid. George Carlin's humor is often very, very social democratic or Marxian. It can be crass also, and it can be sometimes insensitive, but overall I like George Carlin's humor. And I think that George Carlin's humor could definitely have a lot to say about our time. He likes to kind of make fun of different personalities. And I think, he makes fun of overly hawkish guys. He makes fun of, the names people have. He has all kinds of routines. He liked to make fun of, he liked to kind of ridicule, aspects of American society. And he had kind of a baby boomer hippie leftist edge to him. I would recommend, if you want, kind of a humorous, crass comedy, listen to George Carlin. I'd recommend that. Good super chat. What would a socialist Europe look like? Well, it would be a Europe where the banks, factories, and industries are organized to support public good and not simply for profits. And the banks, factories, and industries were organized by the people. It would be a centrally planned economy, raising people out of poverty, making sure everyone had jobs and healthcare and education. I think that would be what Europe under socialism would look like, and countries trading with each other on win-win cooperation, an end to the system of imperialism where European banks and corporations are keeping the world poor to enrich themselves. It would be a centrally planned economy in Europe, raising people out of poverty, peace with the rest of the world. That's what socialist Europe would look like. Alrighty, what was this last one? Didn't Democrats support protests? Okay, all right. Didn't support protests. All right. Progressive Dems, anti-police, pro-immigrants. No, I mean, there was a huge uprising around Black Lives Matter over the summer, because that's an issue that for years the black community has been struggling around. And yeah, I mean, as the rebellion exploded, some of the Democratic Party gave support to it. And there's some struggles around the police departments and stuff. But overall, I mean, the Democratic Party has been the party of lock 'em up. Bill Clinton, his presidency saw a huge expansion of the prison industrial complex. Under Obama, there was the reason that Black Lives Matter exploded under Obama is because things got worse for the black community. There was a black president, and things got worse in terms of mass incarceration. Things got worse in terms of police brutality. People had videos showing police brutality, and things got worse. And that, the reason that Black Lives Matter really exploded under Obama was because the Democratic Party was not hearing the voices of average people. So, no, I'm not seeing that. I'm not seeing it at all. And same for the immigration thing. A lot of, immigrant communities, the Democrats have this, they talk about the Dreamers, and they talk about comprehensive immigration reform. But at the end of the day, they're not helping immigrant communities, right? They're not ending the ICE raids. No, I don't see the Democrats protecting the immigrant communities. They talk that game like they're more friendly to the immigrant communities. But at the end of the day, they have created a situation where immigrant communities are under the gun, where workers get paid less than legal wages, where, immigrant communities are terrified of ICE raids and deportations. And so, criminal gangs flourish like MS-13. I mean, the Democrats, they don't play up the anti-immigrant rhetoric like Republicans do, but they are very much responsible for the situations facing both, facing immigrant communities, but facing non-immigrant communities too. Look, the immigration situation, this is what I've always said, okay? Here's the thing. Immigrant workers are not our enemies. They're not, right? Immigrant workers are not our enemies. They're not destroying our communities. They're not destroying our jobs. But the situation that creates mass migration is a nightmare. People not being able to live in their homes, fleeing into the United States, dead bodies. Every day they find dead bodies along the U.S. border. Every day, right? People can't live in their countries. Neoliberal economic reforms have destroyed Honduras. They've destroyed Guatemala. It's a nightmare, right? The USA and the refugee situation, the USA, funds terrorism and instability in Syria and funds terrorism and instability in Libya. People are drowning in the Mediterranean and dying trying to get into Europe. This is a nightmare. It's not the American dream. It's not a great situation. No, I mean, this is a bad situation. And the Democrats just want to say, oh, immigration is great. No. People not being able to stay in their home countries. People, fleeing out of economic desperation. This is a bad situation. It's a bad situation. It's a nightmare. And it's a nightmare for, it's also a nightmare for the working people in this country, right? The working people in this country, right? Having people fleeing into the country over the border and criminal gangs smuggling people into the country, that's not a good situation. The whole neoliberalism, the global system of free market capitalism, driving countries into poverty, creating a mass crisis of refugees, driving down living standards, destroying communities, is bad for immigrants from around the world, and it's bad for working people in this country. Neoliberalism, The global system of monopoly capitalism, where a small group of billionaire and bankers dominate the world and are driving and grinding the world into poverty, is bad. And the solution to the immigration crisis is not a big giant wall, and it's definitely not ICE raids, and, and it's not just pretending everything's okay either, right? That's the solution. So the Republicans say, oh, we're going to be mean to immigrants, and we're going to deport them, and we're going to build a wall. That's not going to solve the problem. Meanwhile, Democrats going, hey, everything's great, it's the American dream. Yeah, that's not going to solve the problem. The problem is going to be solved by socialism. If imperialism was no longer destroying developing countries, if infrastructure was being built, if the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund weren't destroying countries, meanwhile, if the United States were becoming economically prosperous by engaging in win-win cooperation, if we had central planning, if we had something like China's Belt and Road, the problem would be resolved. And the right, with their bigotry, is not going to solve the problem. And the left, by pretending everything's okay, is not going to solve the problem. This is a crisis created by capitalism, and in particular, the international policies, the wars and the predatory international banking of capitalism. And the way it's going to be resolved is with central planning and socialism and city building. So there you go. All right. India-China water issues. Well, look, I have been an advocate of irrigation, right? When Gaddafi built the world's largest irrigation system, the Great Man-Made River, that was utterly amazing. And wouldn't it be amazing if Russia and China and India were to team up to build a huge irrigation system to the parts of Central Asia and India that were dry and didn't have access to water, and started greening the desert and expanding the ability to create global farmland, right? Think about how much land there is in the world right now that is desert, that if a huge irrigation system were constructed, and we started taking water from, the frozen ice caps and bringing it down to Central Asia. Think about all the desert areas, all the dry areas that could suddenly become full of lush farmland, right? There's malnutrition going on in many parts of the world right now as a result of this pandemic. Imagine if, with state central planning, Russia, China, the United States, India, we all teamed up and started building a huge irrigation system, bringing water to places like India, and expanding the ability of farmland to be created, right? Imagine if the Middle East was no longer just the oil, the desert, the part of the world with oil and sand, right? Imagine if all those deserts in the Middle East were full of, of fields growing crops, and, there was a vibrant economy springing up in all these Arab countries that are just, weapons purchasers and oil sellers, and all of a sudden they had vibrant economies. Imagine that. Right? That's what economic development is. And I would be absolutely in favor of China and India and a number of other countries teaming up for a global irrigation effort. I would be for that. I would absolutely be for that. All right. How would we transition the United Arab Emirates to socialism? I really don't know. Right? The United Arab Emirates, those are kingdoms, right? Those are, emirates, right? It's different. You got Dubai, you got Abu Dhabi, it's the UAE. I don't know enough about their legal system there, about how they would transition to socialism. I really just don't know. I've been there. I've walked around the streets of UAE before as I was changing planes and had to stay overnight and such, but I actually do not know. I really just don't know about how to transition the UAE to socialism. So I'd have to study their legal system more. All right. Didn't the Democrats support the protests? Well, Mitt Romney claimed he supported the protests. The whole mainstream media claimed they supported the protests. But, it's just like they claim they support Dr. Martin Luther King now. They didn't. The FBI urged Martin Luther King to kill himself. They, sent stories to Newsweek claiming that Martin Luther King was secretly gay. And, but now they want to take credit for it. For years. When I was in Cleveland, I went to court with police brutality victims in Cleveland. In 2010, 2009, nobody was talking about Black Lives Matter. But in Cleveland, Black on Black Crime Incorporated and Art McCoy, and, there was the Whitby family. I was involved in their case in Cleveland, a horrendous case of police brutality. And there was a whole situation where I video recorded the police beating up some protesters at a student walkout. And police brutality has been an issue in the Black community for years. And the Democrats have been ignoring it and pandering to the cops. And for years, they have been doing nothing, nothing. And just, ignoring it. And with the George Floyd thing and the pandemic, there was an explosion. There was an explosion that they couldn't ignore. And the Democrats also, let's be real, they didn't like Trump, and they thought we can blame the unrest on Trump, the instability on Trump. And so there's different factors there. But no, I don't think the Democrats ultimately, when it really gets down to it, the Democrats serve the same state apparatus, right? Kamala Harris, her whole career is built on mass incarceration. Look at her record of locking up innocent people and gleefully doing so. I mean, Kamala Harris is a demented, cruel sadist who loves cops and loves prisons and loves destroying people's lives. Read my book about Kamala Harris. No, I mean, look, Bernie Sanders. There's an interview with Bernie Sanders. I like a lot of things Bernie Sanders says, but in the Michael Moore movie, Capitalism, a Love Story, they ask Bernie Sanders, what does it mean to be a socialist? He says, it means that there are people like cops who don't make enough money. And I want cops to get paid more. Even Bernie Sanders, it's like first word out of Bernie Sanders' mouth when they ask him if you're a socialist. Cops need to get paid more. That's what socialism means. Socialism means cops get paid more. I mean, come on. No, the Democrats, no, they are not supporters of the protest movement against police brutality. No, they are not. Okay. What do I think of James Connolly? James Connolly was a great Irish revolutionary, leader of the Irish people in their fight for national liberation. He was here in the United States for a little while, was part of the Industrial Workers of the World, went back to Ireland, organized the Irish people, pushed Marxism and workers' class struggle along with Irish national liberation. That was a big contribution of his, was he seemed to combine the two movements, and it's very similar to Lenin's theory of the national question, how the Irish could fight okay, all right, I'll buy myself some French fries. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you very much. That's very, very kind of you for the super chat. But you combine the Irish national liberation question with the socialist question, and he wrote a lot of very important essays. He was a very important Irish socialist revolutionary. He wrote a poem, "We Only Want the Earth," right? "For our demands most modest are, we only want the earth," right? James Connolly, and he was killed as part of the uprising, the Easter Uprising. He was the leader of the Easter Uprising, and he was executed, for leading the Easter Uprising. James Connolly. So, yeah, I mean, I have a very high opinion of James Connolly. Great revolutionary, great Irish freedom fighter. Yeah, I mean, just an amazing man in many ways. A great hero of the Irish working class, a great socialist and internationalist. He combined, that a revolutionary is both a patriot and an internationalist. James Connolly loved Ireland. He loved the Irish people. But he understood that, the only way for the Irish people to gain their freedom was to join arm in arm with the working people of the world. So he was a patriot for Ireland, and he fought for Ireland's national liberation, died struggling for Ireland's national liberation. But his goal was not just to free Ireland, but it was that Ireland would emerge as the eventual emergence of a socialist world. So it's there's contradictions there. But if you read, in Chairman Mao's little red book, there's a whole chapter called Patriotism and Internationalism. It explains this. Communists are on the one side the most patriotic people, and on the other side the most internationalist people, right? They're both of those things, right? And James Connolly was a great Irish revolutionary freedom fighter, fighting for the working class, fighting for Irish people. Just a great person. There's a song about him by Black 47, which is like an Irish rock band. They did a song about James Connolly, Black 47. And, James Connolly is still widely admired and loved in Ireland as just a national freedom fighter and hero. So there you go. All right, on that note, folks, I'm going to end it here. So thanks for hanging around. Glad I could answer all your questions. And we'll be in touch. There you go. Oh, there's a super chat I missed. Thoughts on leftist movements being leaderless and decentralized, advantages and disadvantages. I didn't realize I missed that super chat. So before I go, I'll answer that real quick. Look, to some degree or other, some level of autonomy is necessary. In the strength of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front was their ability to have autonomous cells. And that has actually been a strength of the communist movement, is that, you know, in World War II, and in a lot of countries where communists have organized, and actually in communist armed struggles, actually, of all things, not even talking politics, we're talking armed struggles. One thing the communists, the autonomy of little cells and their ability to operate autonomously has been a strength, right? While there's central leadership, the ability of the individual cell to organize on its own has been key. And that it's, again, it's a combination. You know, one of the problems that a lot of communist groups have is that they're organizing, they don't really allow people to blossom, right? They don't allow people to make their full contribution. That's a problem. But then there's the other problem is, you know, there's a lot of left-wing organizing that's very, very individualist. It's just everyone just doing what they want, and you don't really get things done. So you need centralization to get things done, but you also need to maximize the potential of every individual. So it's a contradiction. It's a tightrope. I mean, so there you go, right? On the one hand, you want to centralize and combine all efforts and get everyone coordinating their actions. But on the other hand, you want to utilize the full potential of each person. And you don't want to just sit on, you know, when there's so much potential that can be used, and you don't use it because you're too centralized. And so, you know, in the bureaucracy, it's complicated. It's a contradiction. So on that note, folks, now I've answered all the super chats. I am going to conclude. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, but the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. Good night.